The main character worked as a mentor for only 3 years, and perhaps this story would never have begun if the letter of recommendation had not fallen into the hands of one gentleman. He wanted to know why the lady had left her job with the Count's family, who had written the letter of recommendation about her previous place of employment. Smiling sweetly, the heroine admitted that she had to leave the Count's family solely for personal reasons, and all the work was done responsibly. This man was damn meticulous and could not believe that the lady really left for personal reasons. The Count's family was probably well off, and the place of work was simply wonderful. To be honest, she couldn't give him a truthful answer, and she certainly couldn't tell a stranger that she had once been reborn as another person. Moreover, she also couldn't tell that his master, the Duke, would one day kill her after 14 years, and now she was going to change her fate to stay alive. The third daughter in the Baron's family, Agnes May Graham, was particularly unlucky, although they were not rich, but the once warm and happy family collapsed due to fraud. Naturally, the previously concluded engagement was broken off, and from that day on the heroine was forced to work in order to survive, and marriage was out of the question. At first, she planned to wait until the situation settled down and find a new partner for marriage, but she surprisingly liked the job as a teacher, which she took out of necessity. And so her wonderful time flowed, while she spent her whole life with the Duke's children, and in this she found her true happiness. She taught her children moral principles and the right way to live, and so her life went on day after day, waiting for something to change one day. Spending time with her children every day, she didn't have time to realize that she had missed the right age for marriage, and now it was too late. For Agnes, a stable life became more important, so she decided to live out the rest of her life alone after she retired, and so she chose the Marquis of Reynolds's house as her final place of work. Life in the Marquis's house went smoothly as she had planned, even though the young man had illegitimate twins at such a young age. He was such a hopeless person that he himself needed a teacher, and the heroine planned to work for 5 years and then leave to finally take care of her own life. But the Marquis's children adored her incredibly, and the teacher became like a mother to them, without whom they could not live a day, constantly demanding her attention. Every day she was close to the twins, enjoying the moments spent with the children, and it was they who kept her afloat in the harsh reality. One of the twins asked the teacher to pay attention to him. In his hands, he was holding a bouquet, not huge, but touchingly tender, as if woven from morning dew and shy smiles. He himself collected it on the lawn, choosing the most beautiful and fresh flowers, putting a modest gift, a piece of his soul, a timid hope for approval and gratitude. The teacher dropped to one knee to be on the same level as the boy and accepted the bouquet, a slight blush touching her cheeks. Thus, 3 happy years passed, but the town was attacked, the traitor was captured, his small children fled, the Marquis was accused of treason, and Agnes had to hide with the children to protect them. They hid in one of the city's alleys. The teacher warned that when everything calmed down, the kids needed to slowly start going out in the opposite direction. She was sure that the twins would cope, but the little ones cried and were afraid that their teacher would never return, shedding bitter tears. The heroine understood that it was not safe here, and with each new explosion, the hope of saving the children melted away like candle wax in the wind. She hugged the babies tighter, feeling their little bodies trembling, her heart breaking with fear and despair. But she had to make a decision to save them. A crazy idea came to her mind, to send the twins alone. It was the only chance, albeit a ghostly one. She knew where they should run, but she didn't know if they would survive. Agnes released them into the war-torn world with a heavy heart, praying that they would survive, tears choking her. But she knew she had done everything in her power to protect their lives, even if it meant parting with them forever. As soon as the children managed to escape, the teacher was immediately captured, and one of the soldiers declared that, without a doubt, this was the same woman who hid the traitor's children. Now kneeling, she understood that her life could be doomed. There was not a drop of compassion in the knight's eyes, only a cold determination to carry out the order. The important thing was that her secret was revealed. She was not given the opportunity to justify herself, to beg for forgiveness, or even to find out what happened to the children. The Main Knight raised his sword, and this was a sign. He stopped in front of her, a powerful figure looming like a storm cloud over a fragile flower, his voice, low and muffled, sounding like a clap of thunder. This man was the Duke of Battenberg, who wanted to know where the teacher had managed to hide the traitor's children, for whom they had come to his duchy. Agnes understood that the Duke was a relative of the Marquis, but for some reason he was now acting personally, and she had no idea how serious the situation was. The knights led the young man by the arms, declaring that they had captured a traitor, while the young gentleman asked to let the dirty villains go, but at that moment he saw the Duke. The young man begged his uncle to save him, declaring that he was absolutely innocent, he was set up, and he should believe, because he was his only nephew. The Duke swung his sword sharply at the young man, calling him a fatal flaw left by his sister, who died without ever seeing his shame. The young man asked to spare him, at least for the sake of what they had experienced together, since the Duke was his uncle, but today the cold-blooded gentleman was merciless. The teacher could not believe her eyes, because the body of the young man fell to the ground, and the Duke had only killed his relative. She couldn't believe how he could cruelly kill his only nephew, whom he had raised with his own hands since childhood. He then turned to the teacher and stated that, judging by her silence after she saw what had happened, it didn't seem like she would easily confess everything. The steel, cold and merciless, touched the girl's neck. The blade of the sword, sharpened, left an unpleasant chill on the skin, foreshadowing imminent death. The Duke stated that in any case these were just small children, and at best they would be able to hide, and it would be enough to burn everything here to the ground so that they would not survive. He spoke as if he was asking about the weather. The lady gathered her last strength. The fear that had gripped her suddenly retreated. Replaced by determination, she knew she would not betray them. Naturally, Agnes did not want to die just because she was involved in the betrayal of this miserable Marquis, and in a quiet whisper she asked the Duke to stop. She didn't want to die protecting his children, but still, she was the only one who could protect these little ones now, who should have a wonderful future ahead of them. But the children, innocent souls who had become victims of intrigue and deceit, looked at her with such hope, with such faith, that it was impossible to retreat. Beautiful moments spent together flashed through her mind, and she couldn't let their fragile lives be broken, destroyed in a ruthless game. Agnes knew she was risking everything. Her life, her freedom were nothing compared to the safety of these children, so she told the Duke that they would not be able to find them. The Duke, holding the weapon of death in his hands, looked down, his face unreadable, and there was not a shadow of doubt in his eyes as he swung his sword. At that moment, the heroine realized that the Marquis should have raised this man correctly from the very beginning, so that he would become a sane person who would never think about rebellion. If she had been in his place, she would have done everything possible to correct the character of this stupid Marquis, and the bloody rebellion that had taken place would never have happened. The green tea, presented to the heroine in a porcelain mug, slowly exuded a fragrant aroma throughout the room. This girl was destined to change her fate, and she happily thanked the maid for the aromatic hot drink that she was about to touch her lips to. She didn't know why, but when she opened her eyes, she went back 14 years into the past, when she was at a young age and only 22 years old. Taking a second chance to escape the rebellion was one option, but even in her new life, she couldn't pretend she didn't know these children. Having said goodbye in terrible fear, under the explosions and rumbles of the uprising, they probably knew that she would never return, and they would not be able to meet and embrace again. But right now, Marquis Reynolds was only 8 years old, and had just lost his parents, so he was given to his uncle, the Duke of Battenberg, to raise. A man in a strict, elegant suit asked the girl if she liked the taste of the tea, and she appreciated it because this tea was truly exquisite. She didn't know how this could be, but this was a chance to save the poor child, a great opportunity to correct the Marquis's corrupt behavior and prevent the uncle from killing his nephew with his own hands. Agnes admitted that the maid had used the fine leaves to brew the tea, and she had enjoyed it immensely, but the man would have been better prepared for what Marquis Reynolds would grow up to be. A golden opportunity is a rather old-fashioned saying, but it's the only way to describe a return to the past, and the man who had caused her death, Timothy Reynolds, was now only 8 years old. His mother, the eldest daughter of the Duke of Battenberg, and his father, the eldest son of the Marquis Reynolds, died in an accident, so the Duke took in the orphaned Timothy. The fact that the Duke's family was looking for a teacher was a golden opportunity, so the heroine couldn't miss the chance, but the person who was looking at her cover letter was too demanding. In fact, the letter from the county asked that the teacher not be hired because they hoped she would not work here. The lady laughed and admitted that the count was probably a real prankster and was trying to play a cruel joke on her. The man asked how the children at Westwick's house were doing, and the heroine said that they were in many ways like their mother and were wonderful children. In reality, these kids were cute little walking problems, and under normal circumstances, she would have stayed for another year, and even after being fired after the revival, they interacted often. But rumors had already spread, and frankly speaking, a man in a normal situation would not have offered such a job to a young lady, given these facts. The lady actually came here without any information, and only knew that the Marquis and his wife had died in an accident, and the Duke had taken his nephew into his care. And that's why she went to the county, because they were looking for a new teacher, but the man admitted that there was actually something else. There were many people working here before she came, and the last one who worked here a week ago was an experienced teacher with 15 years of experience. But even she couldn't cope with the young gentleman's character, and in the end she quit, running away in horror, without working with this child for even a month. The man said that the previous teacher left in tears, and said that she would never again cross the threshold of this terrible place. So, to prevent bad rumors from spreading, they urgently looked for a new teacher who would live here and take care of the child every day. They said the young master was so difficult to handle that even the regular class schedule had to be followed, but the teacher said everything would be fine. The man insisted that the girl did not yet have experience working as a live-in teacher, and he was not sure that her 3 years of experience would be enough. Agnes insisted and planned to start gaining this experience right away, and even though she had little experience, she was proud that she had lived her rather difficult life. The man decided not to stop the teacher in her persistence, because she was incredibly insistent. In any case, they had little time to find a suitable candidate. The lady was incredibly happy that she had finally been hired, and she was happy to start right from today, and in no way blame the man. To begin with, the butler promised to show her the room, asking her to follow him, and from tomorrow she would be able to meet the young master. The man's name was Carlo Vishov. He had worked as a butler in this palace for many years, and she asked if she could call him by his position. Since the teacher had been hired, she was supposed to greet his lordship, but as far as the butler knew, the gentleman was busy now and would not return soon. He told the details of living in the mansion and asked the new teacher not to worry, because the gentleman left the hiring of teachers under his responsibility. Looking around, the heroine examined the beautiful estate, and as expected from one of the richest aristocratic families, everything here was incredibly luxurious. Ethan Henry Battenberg was one of the great dukes of the family, the man who killed her and who is the closest aide to the only crown prince, a skilled knight, infamous for his coldness and ruthlessness. Realizing that it was impossible to come to the same future again, the heroine did not understand why people called him handsome, because he was a damn scary person. The butler promised a decent salary, and the lady asked not to worry, although you couldn't tell from her, but she coped well with the most disobedient children. Agnes promised to take care of the young gentleman no matter what his character was, and she believed that this time she would definitely succeed. When they approached the young gentleman's room, the heroine heard the strange cries of a girl who begged the boy not to do this under any circumstances. The heroine saw a strange picture. A young gentleman was holding a centipede in his hands, trying to throw it right into the face of a maid who was terribly afraid of insects. The boy was holding a centipede in his hands, and his attention was only distracted by the fact that the butler arrived in his room with some unknown lady. The centipede moved in his hands, moving all its paws, and the young gentleman asked in a menacing, childish voice what was going on and who dared to interfere with him. The lady promised to make a normal person out of this boy, and the butler, staggering back, warned once again that the teacher must start work from tomorrow. The butler reminded her that the girl hadn't even signed the contract yet, but she was sure that after their conversation he had made it clear to her that she had definitely been hired. The previous teachers said the same thing and ran away on the first day as soon as they saw the young master, and it was not just a matter of education or making a living. Agnes gave the butler her suitcase with things and asked the gentleman not to worry anymore, because now this young rascal was in her hands. Looking at the disheveled boy who was still holding the insect in his hands, she understood who she would be dealing with, but she promised that she would never run away. On the one hand, the butler was incredibly glad that the girl did not run away in the first seconds, but the heroine understood perfectly well that this was now her survival strategy. This child was Timothy Evan Reynolds, the notorious brat of the Marquis, who was outraged that they were chatting with each other right in front of him. While the boy was trying to figure out if it was really a new teacher standing in front of him, the lady looked angrily at the young master who would kill her in the future. She tried to calm down because she understood that this child was not guilty of anything. If she treated him sincerely, in the end, he would understand everything. The teacher just wanted everyone to be happy and for this child not to grow up to be a horrible, cold-blooded monster who would kill people without thinking twice in the future. The young gentleman called the butler an old man and said that he had previously asked him not to accept such ugly things anymore, but he did not listen to him. Agnes believed that sincerity would really help her, and smiling sweetly, she told the young gentleman that he shouldn't communicate like that with adults. The young gentleman crossed his little hands in front of him and became indignant. He was sure that he had told the truth, and the lady suggested calling him Timati, not young gentleman. The boy got nervous because the teacher was going to call him by name, and he shouted for the old man to immediately remove this woman from his sight. The heroine was already quite a grown-up girl and tried to control herself and stay calm, while the young gentleman was unhappy that she had ruined all his fun. She even tried to guess what his fun consisted of, and the boy mocked the other maids with the help of insects. He, the teacher, said that even if a person's status is lower than the young master, he cannot bully others. She, the boy, is not used to being spoken to like that, and asked the teacher to immediately get out of his room. From today on, Agnes was officially hired, so he couldn't fire her just at will, and the teacher asked him to apologize to the maid. The young gentleman was indignant. The teacher went crazy and suddenly decided to tell him who he should apologize to, promising to make her want to quit here herself. The heroine confidently replied that she was not going to leave here, and from that day on she was accepted to the position, and the young gentleman should immediately apologize to the harmless girl. The boy was not used to apologizing to anyone, and was sure that he could do whatever he wanted, especially if the person's title was lower than his. Agnes asked him to apologize to the maid again, because he had mocked her without knowing that she was scared. But instead of words of apology, the boy called her a worthless thing. Trying to instill moral standards in the young gentleman from the very first minutes, the lady told him that when a person does something wrong, he must apologize. The young master didn't realize that he had done anything wrong, and the maid only excitedly indulged his prank, and she was just a servant. The boy nervously asked why the teacher was interfering with his wrong and apologized because even the maid confirmed that he had done nothing wrong. Agnes insisted that one should not force others to do anything, and Timati was clearly behaving incorrectly and should apologize as soon as possible. The young master considered these words to be complete nonsense, and in his opinion the teacher was talking nonsense because he was much higher than this insignificant servant. The boy's title was the highest in the palace, and he took full advantage of his position, calling the butler an old man and assuring him that the maid was obliged to listen to him. He waved his little hand angrily and shouted, the teacher heard his words perfectly well and must obey him, like everyone else in this palace. Now the heroine understood that it seemed the boy really had grown up to be a terrible, impudent fellow, and that was why his correction would become even more pleasant. Timati really did have the highest status of all, but that in no way justifies his terrible actions. His status is one of the reasons why this child grew up to be a real tyrant. His parents died. He inherited the title of Marquis at a young age. In the estate of his ran is second only to the Duke, so no one can punish him carelessly. Agnes's words gradually began to irritate the young master, and he shouted that it had become too loud in this palace with her appearance. The maid stood trembling in fear as the young master continued to mock her, intending to force her to fulfill his next impudent request. He asked to take the centipede that was darting around the floor, knowing full well how terrified the girl was of insects. The maid did not want to pick up the insect, and the sight of the northern-legged insect made her feel sick, but Timati said that she was obliged to obey orders. Timati had an incredibly nasty character, and he only wanted everyone around him to suffer. But instead of the maid, the teacher bravely took the insect into her hands. He specifically asked the maid to pick up the centipede, knowing that she was terribly afraid of them, but the lady said she picked up the insect and asked where to take it. The boy certainly didn't expect the young lady to take the centipede so easily, while the teacher waved an ordinary bug in front of his face, which she wasn't afraid of. Tamati was even taken aback, because he didn't understand how to behave any further, and just wanted to see how the maid would be afraid to pick up an insect. Holding the centipede in her hands, the lady continued to ask Tamati if she should take it to his room, since he himself said to take it in her hands and take it somewhere. The teacher realized that the boy did not react when she held the centipede, but was afraid when she shoved the insect in his face, and the lady took advantage of this with pleasure. Agnes waved the centipede right in front of the young gentleman's face, and he screamed in horror for the teacher to move away immediately, because he had clearly told her to get lost. Tamati screamed at how such an ugly woman could behave so brazenly and arrogantly, waving a terrible insect in front of the gentleman's face. In this game, the teacher won, but the next second the boy kicked her so hard right in the knee that the centipede fell out of her hands. Agnes sat down on the floor from a strong, aching pain, because Tamati hit her right in the leg and hit her with all his strength, screaming that the dirty, ugly thing would be punished. The young gentleman stamped his little tiny feet and wished that the teacher would never dare to appear in front of him again, because she made him sick. Trying to calm down, Agnes convinced herself that she was not angry at all, that you can't be angry at a small child, because it's not his fault that he was raised that way. Tamati crushed the centipede with such force that his shoe flew off his foot and shouted that if the teacher didn't want to end up like that bug, she should get out of here immediately. Agnes realized he immediately took off his shoes, and apparently he really did hate insects, but there was something she needed to teach him before the first lesson. Taking his little boot in her hands, on the sole of which a trampled centipede was proudly displayed, she was about to teach him his first lesson. Agnes declared that the young gentleman must wear shoes when leaving the room, and holding a shoe with a centipede in her hands, she offered to help Tamati put on his shoes. Tamati could clearly see that on the sole of his tiny shoe there was a smeared, horrible centipede, which caused him incredible horror. Agnes brought the boot closer and closer, offering Tamati to put it on, because the boot was sad because he had taken it off and thrown it aside. The boy ran out of the room screaming loudly, declaring that this woman was definitely crazy and insane, while Agnes tried to get him back. This time the game was played according to Agnes's rules. She managed to cope with Tamati's impudent behavior, who disappeared without a trace in the corridor, frightened by a centipede on his shoe. She found a boy in one shoe, dirty and disheveled, standing on the roof, who as soon as he saw Agnes knew that the lady was persistent. These two were definitely worth each other, and Agnes screamed at Tamati to just give in and put on his shoes, because his foot probably already hurt. They were on the roof of the servants' quarters. The boy was screaming he didn't need this at all, asking Agnes not to move and under no circumstances to come near him. The little brat declared that he would fire the obnoxious teacher, but Agnes knew perfectly well that he had not hired her, so he could not fire her. He stamped his foot on the roof and was nervous, asking the teacher to shut up, because his absence meant only no, but at this moment, the boy could get hurt. It was really dangerous on the roof, and she asked Tamati to come to him, but he did not want to listen to a native like her, brazenly calling Agnes rude words. Continuing to stamp his feet with all his might, he asked the teacher not to act arrogantly. Small stones were already flying from the roof, and the situation was becoming dangerous. Tamati was outraged that someone dared to order him around and decided to teach him, and he didn't give a damn about the teacher, and the boy was simply furious. Agnes understood that this child was not angry with her at all, and he was absolutely not to blame for his rude behavior. As much as he hated insects, he had no reason to be so angry at the man he had met for the first time this morning. The child was probably not angry with her at all, so Agnes decided to give in and offered to go down first and asked the boy to go down slowly so that he would not fall. It was unclear then who he was so angry at, continuing to angrily kick the roof with one foot, which had already developed cracks, and his heel suddenly fell right into a broken tile. The little child did not understand at all what he was doing, and Agnes realized that Tamati needed help now, because in a little while he would simply fall off the roof. She tried to grab his hand, but instead she tumbled head over heels off the roof herself, unable to hold on to his little fingers. But Agnes did the right thing, and managed to make Tamati freeze for at least a second, stopping screaming and destroying the roof of the building. Everything turned out just fine, and when the heroine opened her eyes, she realized that she was alive, despite the fact that she had just fallen from a tall building. What a relief, because there was a stable with soft hay below, on which Agnes landed successfully, so she did not receive a single scratch. That first day was just spectacular, but she was glad that Tamati didn't fall off the roof, and she herself was in so much pain that she couldn't even get up. The heroine had just gotten a job as a teacher, and now she was rolling in horse manure, and this incredible smell, which made her eyes water, was simply terrible. Agnes was prepared for this. Everything was not easy. Without a doubt, Tamati turned out to be the most difficult child of all those she had ever encountered. But children never swore at people, and they were afraid of their parents and other adults. But this impudent boy behaved too arrogantly and did not respect anyone at all. First of all, children never get angry at adults without reason, and the lady understood that she couldn't lose her composure. She was an adult, and Tamati was just a baby. Sitting in the horse manure, she wondered how things had gotten to this point on her first day on the job. But on the other hand, it was just wonderful, because today she had actually won. Agnes continued to sit in the stable, but suddenly heard a man's voice laughing, saying that it was not a human corpse at all. This voice seemed to be familiar to her from a past life, and as soon as she saw her burden, she immediately understood who was standing in front of her. The dark-haired Duke of Battenberg appeared before her and asked the lady to stand up, as this place was intended for his horse named Kishu. The Duke of Battenberg was the man who killed her in her past life, and Agnes became so scared that she couldn't even move, continuing to sit in the horse manure. He insistently asked the girl to move, and it was impudent of him to talk like that to a person who had just fallen from the roof, and especially since she was a girl. Now the Duke was only the boy's guardian, but both uncle and nephew were incredibly rude. If he had raised the boy properly, he would have definitely behaved differently. Agnes pulled herself together and said that if a person had fallen and needed help, the first thing to do was to ask if he was okay, and if he was in any pain. She extended her hand, covered in manure, to the Duke, but he only looked in surprise at the stranger, who for some reason was now asking for his help. The lady asked if the young man was not going to help her up, but he suggested standing still and probably did not even intend to help. Agnes said she had just fallen from a high roof, and was he really going to ignore a lady in distress who clearly needed help? She held his hand, hoping the young man would help her up, smiling, wondering if horse manure was too dirty for such a respectable gentleman. Continuing to sit with his hand outstretched, the Duke looked at the foul-smelling lady with bewilderment, assuring her that he had no reason at all to help. There was no need for a reason to help a person, and Agnes knew that if a person had a good heart, he would not ask such stupid questions. The cold-blooded young man did not want to listen to lectures at all if there was no reason for him. Then he was not going to do what he did not want to do. Agnes admitted that sometimes a person must do the right thing even if there is no reason for it, but instead her thought that he had definitely not seen this girl here before. He asked who she was, but the lady continued to assure him that a person in trouble definitely needs help, even if you are seeing each other for the first time in your life. She removed her hand and stood up herself, saying that the young man should take care of his niece or nephew who had lost his parents and was in despair. The Duke was sure that it was none of her business, but the heroine persistently tried to convey to the young man that she had the right to say this, and he would regret it if he continued to live like this. She asked to believe her words, and did not want to allow it to come to this, because Agnes knew very well the future that awaited the Duke. At that moment, the stable doors swung open. Tamati ran in and screamed. The teacher was chewing while the Duke tried to figure out who she was. The butler asked excitedly if everything was okay with her, because Tamati had already told him that the teacher had just fallen from a high roof and still hadn't returned. But the man immediately fell silent as soon as he saw the Duke and the teacher in front of him, in dirty clothes that smelled badly of horse manure. Tamati also stood silently. The butler greeted the Duke, and this situation was too strange to figure out what happened here. Agnes noticed that at the sight of the Duke, Tamati's expression immediately changed, and from an embittered boy he turned into a compassionate young gentleman. Probably no one expected the Duke to be here, and Tamati, with his eyes downcast, continued to stand silently, expecting the Duke to start swearing. The butler decided to lighten the mood a little and asked the gentleman when he had returned, since there had been no message about it. It said a lot about their relationship, and Agnes noticed it immediately. The Duke had just returned, asking if the butler would like to greet him. With such pressure, it was not at all surprising that a small child would rebel and behave in a terrible manner. But now Agnes was about to introduce herself to the Duke. Taking the Duke by the hand, the girl gave her name as Agnes May Graham, declaring that she was the new teacher of young Master Timati. The Duke was surprised. There really was a new teacher standing in front of him, and now it was his turn to introduce himself. The Duke gave his name as Ethan Henry Battenberg, and looking at the firm handshake, asked if the girl would like to let go of his hand. The lady laughed, letting go of the Duke's hand, and said with a grin that it looked like she now had two students, not just one. Hearing these words, the butler Carlo immediately asked the Duke if he would have to fire such a young lady who was working for them for the first day. Ethan didn't fire the teacher because she said she would do everything to make sure he didn't regret it, and there was absolutely no point in firing her. Coming out of the stable, he only quietly said that he wanted to see how long Agnes would last in her new role, being together with the mischievous Timati. The Windows were sure that she could handle everything and that she would definitely look at the one who said these words in the future. Carl was incredibly worried, and the conversation between the Duke and the new teacher was quite unusual. All this time, the girl was shrouded in terrible memories, and she was afraid that she would be killed again, while Carlo was worried about her condition because she had just fallen from the roof. Not expecting to come face to face with the one who would one day kill her, it turned out to be much more terrible than the lady imagined. Little Timati ran up to her and asked if she had broken her leg. Agnes noticed that the young gentleman was worried about her condition, but the boy immediately became indignant that this was simply impossible and blushed. On her first day at work, Agnes had too many events and was tired, but it was worth it because she met both of the people responsible for her death, which meant that she had found the root cause. And since the reason is known, she was going to find a solution soon, and the cold uncle and his nephew with a terrible character would not be able to ruin her destiny. Timati may be a little scoundrel, but he still has a chance to change, because he asked if she was hurt, so his heart is not so bad. Conversation is the greatest tool that humanity has, but there are exceptions, and in those moments one must first learn their language. A new day at the Duke of Battenberg's estate began unusually, and Timati woke up unhappy because someone had painted his face while he was sleeping. Timati looked like a little monkey, and it was quite cute, and Agnes just laughed because he threw frogs in her bed that night. It's not only children who can play pranks on others, and Agnes admitted to her prank, but at least she didn't harm any frogs, and Timati now looked like a clown. He was indignant, who cares about these stupid frogs, but it was the fault of the young master that 2 frogs died, and this was not a joke at all. The boy was sure that he was absolutely innocent of anything the frogs would have died anyway, even if he had not touched them or slipped them into the teacher's bed. After all, he considered himself much more important than some stupid frogs, and at that moment I realized that my trash bin guy would have to learn a lot. The conversation turned to frogs and humans, Agnes trying to prove that if the young gentleman was a human, that did not automatically make him more important than a living being. Timati was sure that people were capable of more. They lived longer, they were stronger, smarter, and he had no idea why frogs played such an important role. Therefore, the frogs did not mean anything to him, but the lady was surprised that, according to the boy's logic, she was definitely more important than him, because she was older, taller, and stronger. But as soon as the boy heard this, he again shouted about his high status, and the lamb tried to argue with him, because then everyone with a high status automatically becomes better than Timati. And it would probably be normal for them to mock the young gentleman, and Timati had such an interesting dialogue for the first time, so he wanted to understand what Agnes meant. The teacher suggested thinking about this in more detail, reflecting after all, could it really be that a living being really has no meaning for him? And only the title is important. Timati was a smart child, and now he should understand the norms of human morality, because Agnes has already managed to interest him. If he understood that his words sounded wrong, that would be enough, and after listening to the teacher's opinion, Timati decided that she really was strange. He didn't understand why she was lecturing the child over a simple prank, but Agnes noticed that Timati was indeed a very smart and intelligent child. The young master thought the teacher was trying to praise him, and he thought it was obvious, but intelligent people deserve respect and should behave accordingly. Agnes was simply trying to communicate in the child's language, and that is why she had an interesting conversation with him, and did not simply yell or scold the boy for his actions. Timati was perplexed because the lady repeated the same thing over and over again. He saw only meaningless logic in her words, but he tried to figure it out. The teacher just laughed. Did the boy really know the word meaningless? And he was indignant, calling him a blockhead, and even if she asked him to write it down, he wouldn't do it. The teacher didn't think that the young gentleman knew so much, but she was sure that he simply didn't know how to spell this word, but it was good that he knew it. Timati shouted. Was the teacher really trying to insult him again? And where she asked to give him a piece of paper with a pen to prove that he could write. On paper, he easily wrote the word nonsense, without a single mistake, in beautiful handwriting. And probably Timati was a very gifted boy who had already been taught. Judging by the way he grew up, he did not receive a proper education, but he had neat handwriting and wrote absolutely without a single mistake. It was very impressive, and looking closely at the written word, Agnes saw a very good and neat handwriting, worthy of an aristocrat. The boy was pleased with his success and praised his knowledge, and Agnes's climb worked perfectly on him, because he had just grabbed a pen and written a whole word. After all, this boy was a child, and the teaching methods worked perfectly on him. Agnes continued to hold in her hands a white piece of paper with a written word, and Timati looked at her attentively and waited for him to be praised. Agnes cast a sweet glance at the young gentleman, and it seemed that he was gradually beginning to behave more sensibly than he had on the first day. The praise was incredibly pleasant for the child, because little ones really love it when they are simply praised and told how great they are. Now it was time to find out if Timati could write other words, and Agnes admitted with admiration that she would like to see his wonderful skills. After a short lesson, it was soon time for a snack, and Agnes asked Timati to go and ask the butler to bring something, asking him to return at exactly 4 o'clock. But here the boy became indignant and asked the teacher not to make him laugh, not understanding why he had to return exactly at the appointed time. Agnes laughed and asked if the young gentleman was trying to escape from class, but Timati felt like the teacher had just called him a coward. Not wanting to stop the mischievous boy, the lady admitted that if he wanted to escape, he could do whatever he wanted. Timati probably didn't expect to hear such an answer, because he was sure that the teacher would strictly order him to appear. But instead, she carefully stroked the boy's head, and at that moment, he felt incredibly strange emotions that he had never felt before. He felt some concern, even though the teacher still kindly asked him to come at the appointed time, and if he did not come, she would go and catch him. She continued to stroke his head, but since Timati was not used to such treatment, he furiously asked Agnes to stop touching his hair. Their communication was already radically different from the first day of their acquaintance. When the boy ran out of the room, she realized something. Somewhere deep inside, this boy was a cutie, and it seemed she was becoming attached to him much faster than she expected. But now she just had to wait a little longer for him to open up completely. Agnes did not know when this would happen, but she felt she had to be patient, and there was only 1 hour left before the appointed time. But the teacher had her own duties. She understood that now she had to hurry to find out something. It had been 10 days since she had started working at the Battenberg estate, and in that time she had managed to learn a few things so far. First, Timati often plays pranks on children. Second, he hates beetles and amphibians. And third, even if he hates them, he is ready to tolerate them for the sake of a joke. Fourth, this boy is very easily hurt, especially if he hears words that sound as if Agnes thinks he is hopeless or stupid. Fifth, in such cases he simply looks at the person, tightly pursing his lips, and at that moment strong emotions rage in his little childish heart. And this child is not one of those children who is easy to handle, and the lady was clearly aware of this. Johann met her, surprised that the lady had come again today. She believed that if she was patient, one day this boy would open up to her, but now she had to insist that Johann open the door for her, but he refused. But there is something that is much more difficult to deal with than this, and that was Johann's persistence, so today the heroine decided to lie on the floor again. Johann begged her to relent, saying it was not proper behavior for a lady, but Agnes always got her way and realized it was too late. She lay down in front of the door right on the floor, and now she had absolutely no time. She was ready to lie on the floor and cry, but Johann was unlikely to put up with it. She just wanted to report the progress of her training to her parent, but for some reason Johann stopped her, claiming that his lordship had told her to report it to the butler. Agnes insisted that she must report the student's progress to his parent, and Johann said that his lordship hated noise even more than being distracted. So now she was going to make a hysterical scene so that they would both be scolded, because it would not only be her fault, but also Johann himself. Johann's attempts were in vain, and soon the lady heard that she could come in, and the door, which she had been unable to get into for a long time, was finally opened. Johann understood everything, but he didn't understand one thing: why only his lordship continued to let the teacher in, and he wondered if it would end again in 15 minutes. He guessed that perhaps the Duke had special treatment for her, because she was the first teacher to stay in the mansion for more than 10 days. Everyone was grateful. Because of her cheerful nature, she took all the young master's pranks on herself, and at that moment, Agnes entered the office. Johann stood near the master's door, trembling all over. It was most likely fearlessness rather than cheerfulness. The second piece of information she gathered concerned the Duke of Battenberg himself, who was certain that he had not asked the teacher to be counted every day. This man showed no interest in young Timati, so Agnes was indignant because he had just told her to come in. She gave him a piece of paper with the word Timati written on it and told him that the young gentleman himself had written it today, and that he already knows and can write similar words. The Duke was surprised that Timati could already write on his own, because he was sure that this child was absolutely untalented. Agnes admitted that Timati is a very smart boy. For his age, his vocabulary is above average. Besides, he is quite agile, and it is probably worth teaching him fencing. But last night he put frogs in her bed again, and it looks like he even caught them himself, and frogs are incredibly difficult to catch. The Duke was about to ask Carlo to teach the boy fencing, but he seemed not to hear what the teacher was saying about his nephew. He didn't even look in her direction once, and she definitely didn't believe that he was listening to what she was telling him, although the young man claimed the opposite. Sighing, the Duke simply grabbed his head and admitted that all of this was incredibly irritating to him. But Agnes said that caring for a child must be annoying and troublesome because the process of raising a child is quite a labor-intensive undertaking. No matter how much she asked the Duke to look her in the eye when talking, he tirelessly looked away, trying with all his might not to pay attention to Agnes. Timati is afraid of his uncle, and he probably doesn't want to be hated, so he tries to do something so as not to anger the Duke. Although he may do reckless things that cause others to dislike him, a child who loses both parents in an instant will crave attention from his guardian. Normally, people would check in at least once or twice to see how their child was doing, but the Duke seemed uninterested in anything other than his duties and fencing. Agnes thought he was as bad at communicating as the young master, but at least the child knew how to express his emotions, while the Duke seemed to lack this ability. For the last 10 days, the same thing had been happening. Mr. Ethan didn't even pretend to listen. And did he really think that Agnes didn't understand that he was only answering in order to get it over with and throw her out of the office? Today, she was not going to let this slide, and at that moment, the gentleman declared that he was giving this child everything he needed to develop. Housing, food, servants. He and she were not even teachers, and if the boy wanted to do something, he was ready to support him. Even now, as his guardian, he took the time to listen to his progress in learning, but the Duke did not understand what else the child needed to grow up. The baby needed attention and love, and Agnes knew it sounded idealistic, and yet many people believed that children needed strict education. But she was going to make sure that the young gentleman grew up in excellent conditions and stated that he needed an ideal family environment. The Duke was indignant. From the very beginning, this was an impossible condition. He was not his parent, and was the teacher really suggesting that he be given up for adoption? Inez did not mean this at all, and told the Duke about it, and he did not understand how he could know what the teacher wanted to say with these words. It was as if they were speaking different languages, where the Duke refused to understand Agnes, and she persistently proved to him how much the boy needed love and support. Unable to resolve such a situation in just 10 days, the heroine also couldn't simply force the Duke to blindly follow her instructions. And in general, she should be grateful that he didn't throw her out now, so the lady used the moment to warn that Timati needed to make an effort to understand his uncle, and he should make the same effort in return. Although they spoke the same imperial language, it was as if these two did not understand each other at all, although they heard the words spoken perfectly well. The Duke stated that he really did not understand what the teacher was talking about, and the diagnosis completely agreed with him. So on that note, she decided to try to get closer to the venerable gentleman in order to understand his thoughts, as well as understand the meaning of his actions. Ethan, hearing her words, was surprised that the teacher had actually decided to establish a closer relationship with him. He stated that he had no habit of rolling in manure, as the teacher had recently done, and that they were completely different and would hardly be able to establish contact. Agnes leaned her elbows on the table and declared that she, too, was not at all happy to have such a hobby. But that day, everything happened too spontaneously. In the end, the heroine understood that learning requires patience, and this time she decided to see which of them would win the re-education. Johann was the assistant of the venerable gentleman, and he always strictly followed his instructions, having served in the palace for quite a long time. The Duke had snow-white skin, clear blue eyes, attractive black hair, and all this brought him to the perfection of beauty. He was cold-blooded and withdrawn, which is what attracted the attention of many people, especially the girls of the Empire. Although his lordship was a man, the word handsome suited him perfectly, and even Johann noticed in him that charming attractiveness that drove everyone crazy, yes. An attractive appearance and one of the highest positions in the Empire made the gentleman a man who was admired and desired to be met. But his cold face, on which not even a trace of emotion ever appears, has a strange power of attraction just at first sight. That's why even Johann, entering the Duke's office, stood silently at first, but the gentleman became indignant. Did his assistant really have absolutely nothing to report? Ethan noticed that Johann had been staring at him for a long time, and it was interfering with his work. So early in the morning, he looked through the documents and asked his assistant to speak out. Johann was incredibly interested in what the venerable Duke was talking about with the new teacher, because usually people are afraid of him like fire. But it seems that this girl does not feel an ounce of fear towards the cold-blooded Ethan Battenberg, who can drill a hole with just one look. The Duke looked at him intently, and Johann had to justify himself by saying that he had not meant that the gentleman was intimidating people or anything like that. There is simply an aura of authority around the Duke, Johann admitted. However, enough days have passed, and the teacher is highly praised in the estate. Since Agnes came here, the young gentleman's pranks have become much less frequent every morning. Everyone is busy and discussing what prank the teacher and Timati will play today. Johann heard about this every day and wanted to tell the Duke about the changes in the child's behavior, because before all he did was mock the servants. The Duke continued to silently stare into his assistant, and he realized that now he simply had to remain silent and say nothing more. But suddenly the Duke declared that no one had ordered the assistant to remain silent, and he really wanted to hear how the young gentleman's behavior had changed. Delighted, Johann asked if the Duke was busy, since His Highness the Crown Prince had invited him to dinner just yesterday. Ethan offered to listen to his assistant on the way and wanted him to tell him everything in the smallest details, what changes had occurred during this time. They had to go to the meeting, and the Duke was going to listen obediently to Johann, asking him to simply tell everything he knew. Ethan thought, this girl is confident enough to demand a hand while sitting in manure, so she can last longer than any other teacher, and she is clearly an unusual person. Until now, her voice had not been offensive to the Duke, so he left her. But perhaps today everything could end, because he had finished the work in the estate. There was no longer any need for them to stay here any longer. He remembered her words very well when Agnes said that the Duke would regret it if he continued to live like this. But while she was here, she was not going to allow that to happen. Remembering this, the Duke even smiled to himself, as if Agnes was a person who had never regretted anything in her life. Every evening after a busy day, the lady literally fell onto her bed, exhausted, because all this was simply unbearably hard, mentally and physically. She had to deal with the child's pranks, persuade the parent, and today was another exhausting day for the heroine. For a long time she boasted that she could correct the young master, since she did not want to die, because in the future he would certainly have to kill her. But it was incredibly difficult for the girl to deal with people who did not make contact, but at least Timati was a child, and his feelings were not difficult to understand. Now the problem was with the second student, the Duke of Battenberg, and even though she tried to communicate with him, she still couldn't read his thoughts at all. The heroine had worked with many parents before, but she had never dealt with someone so indifferent, and even wondered whether she should continue all this. Usually Agnes did things completely differently, and parents were interested in their children, but this case was special, and the girl did not understand at all what to do. In whatever house she worked, she never interfered beyond a certain point, and this was her own rule as a teacher. After all, a teacher is not a family member, but simply an employee, and if you interfere unnecessarily, it may happen that she can be fired overnight. For a long time, Agnes helped the children grow up, gave her love and support, but never imposed her opinion on them, and this is a line that both parties should not cross. But this time, she had a completely different goal, and as she lay in the dark room that evening, covering her face with her hands, she tried to figure out how to proceed. She could not understand the Duke at all, why he did not simply fire her, because he could hire another teacher at any moment, saying goodbye to Agnes forever. For some reason, he still kept her close, despite his irritation, and no matter how much the heroine tried to tell this riddle, she couldn't. Puzzling over the Duke's words, she eventually decided to forget about it and let things slide. And if you think about it, after the rebirth she was constantly busy, a hasty dismissal from the Westwick house, and she still regrets that she was not able to say goodbye to her children properly. In her past life, the heroine exchanged letters with the children of the Westwick household, and now she decided that she would like to play a similar role in Battenberg. Help Timati improve, calm him down so that he doesn't get hurt, and keep in touch from time to give good advice at the right time. Usually teachers were hired exclusively for children up to 10 years old, so the heroine understood that she had no more than 3 years left to fix everything. By that time, she would have to create the perfect family production, and when she thought about it, she herself did not understand what she needed to make perfect. All Timati needed was a caring, supportive guardian, and as she pondered all these questions, Agnes asked herself who the Duke would marry in the future. The Duke's wife will become Timati's aunt, that is, another guardian, and will this really lead the young gentleman even further astray from the right path? Thoughts were whirling around in the girl's head, and she tried to stop thinking, but she had some free time, and she continued to think about work. The next morning was very different from the others, and last night the heroine managed to think everything through in order to finally feel better. She drank aromatic tea and talked to Timati, feeling like a beautiful princess in a palace who had tried wonderful, exquisite cookies for the first time. She asked the boy if he wanted more cookies, but instead of the teacher, he addressed her with a strange word, "Hey," without any respect at all. All the previous students called the heroine Agnes, and she declared that a boy should call her teacher, or Agnes, but not Hey. The heroine was in a great mood today, and she even fooled around a little while communicating with Timati, indulging his childish tricks. The lady strictly adhered to the class schedule and informed the boy about it, but she did not understand what kind of strange lesson it was where she just sat on the floor and drank tea. The heroine spent the whole night thinking about how they could have fun and get closer, so she came up with a wonderful way to learn through games. Timati asked not to make fun of his slippers. Indignantly, he was already quite grown up, and Agnes asked if the boy really refused to study. She offered to make a bet that if she cut out and did not continue the game, and if Timati won, then they would continue their studies, but the boy did not want to fall for such a simple trick. The teacher warned him that she had agreed to the bet the boy had proposed earlier, which meant that he now had to accept her terms. Timati was indignant, not understanding what kind of adult would risk his life to win an argument with a child, and then she almost crushed him when she attacked. This time, the heroine could not deliberately lose and hurt the pride of the young gentleman, who shouted that all her tricks were absurd and that she was not behaving like an adult. Agnes smiled at that moment and looked like a beautiful princess, declaring that the world of competition is absolutely ruthless, and Timati will have to accept it. There was nothing she could do, her life was at stake, and last night she had sworn to herself that she would move forward no matter what the circumstances. The lady admitted that she puts her heart and soul into her daily conversations with the young master, and all the training is not just for fun. If the heroine were not sincere, she would not have gotten up at dawn to put fruit puree in Tamati's slippers, and even specially collected overripe fruits so as not to waste good food on a joke. Tamati considered this revenge on the teacher for tying her hair to the bed, and if you think about it, he actually did it very carefully. The boy seemed to be talking to a child, but definitely not an adult, while Agnes tried to figure out who taught him this. After this question, the young gentleman fell silent, not wanting to answer anything, and a drop of misunderstanding appeared in his childish eyes. Probably the heroine made a mistake now, and for the boy, the only person who would braid his hair would definitely be his mother. Tamati asked if he told who taught him to braid his hair like that. What would the teacher do in that case, since he would tell her the whole truth? Agnes was going to ask the young gentleman to do it again, but this time she suggested that he braid his hair nicely into a hairstyle, but not at the head of the bed. She managed to untie her hair because her hands were as dexterous as Tamati's. Thanks to this, she learned something and promised to do it for him one day. Tamati began to think that the teacher was simply crazy because she really wanted to sneak into his room again, but she promised that if the young gentleman did not sneak into her room, then she would not respond in kind. The young gentleman clutched his head, because for him it was completely pointless, until Agnes calmly asked the boy to sit down and drink some tea. He had just lost a bet, so he had to obey, and the teacher reminded him of the agreement not to make noise during tea. The gentleman was incredibly infuriated and irritated by all this to the point of madness, but for some reason, without realizing it, he sat down on the floor in front of the teacher. And he asked to pour hot aromatic tea, and a deal had just been made between them, in which he could not afford to lose. While pouring tea, Agnes understood that perhaps Tamati had restrained himself solely because of the argument, and that was why he had so obediently followed her instructions. He was unlikely to answer her, but this silence was different from the one he had made out of spite at their first meeting, and it meant too much. Perhaps everything went much better than Agnes had expected in the first days. She was very afraid that she would not be able to establish contact with this mischievous boy. Having poured hot tea into a mug, the teacher was about to serve it to the young gentleman, while he was outraged by her incomprehensible muttering. But suddenly Tamati called her ugly and asked her not to make the situation worse, but still picked up a porcelain cup of hot tea. And at that moment, the heroine decided to take her words back, because they still had a long path of re-education ahead of them. This day passed without any serious situations, and Tamati, walking cheerfully down the corridor, thought about what a strange but persistent girl this was. There was nothing special about her to him, but she dared to challenge the Marquis, and this time he simply decided to spill paint all over her clothes. He walked along cheerfully, thinking of a cruel joke, because the lady might get into trouble due to the lack of other clothes, although he himself was ready to buy a couple of outfits. Suddenly, he saw a light on in one of the rooms, but it was too strange, because everyone should have already gone to their rooms and were fast asleep. He opened the door and saw that the maids were still talking and discussing Agnes, calling her a strange aristocrat, and she was just working to get money. One of the maids was sure that the lady must have been an aristocrat before, but who would have thought that she ended up having to take care of this scoundrel? Another heard that the girl's family was going through hard times. It seemed that her father had been deceived, and she was only here because of forced labor. So now she was faced with this little devil, and all this time Tamati was eavesdropping on the conversation of the maids behind the door, who were talking nonsense. The ladies were sure that it was very difficult to look after such a child, but Agnes said that she had to do it, because the job of a teacher is not easy at all. In an empire, everyone must work to earn money, despite the conditions and the person's desire, which may not correspond at all. At that moment, the maid clearly heard someone standing behind the door, but at that moment, Tamati was already running as fast as he could down the dark corridor. Agnes slept peacefully in her bed, but that night Tamati decided that the teacher must suffer and poured paint on her in her sleep. Agnes immediately woke up screaming what was happening and immediately realized that her entire hair, clothes, and body were covered in a strange, foul-smelling paint. It was not an easy paint, and Tamati specially selected a strong paint that smelled incredibly and was very difficult to wash off. In front of her, she saw a young gentleman with a small bag in his hands. I understand that this little devil had just poured paint all over her from head to toe in her sleep. If you splash paint in a person's face, it can get into their eyes and the person can become permanently blind, and a drop of paint just happened to get into the girl's eye. She didn't understand why the young master was so angry, but he angrily told the teacher to leave immediately and never show up at the estate again. His behavior was incredibly strange, and something definitely happened. But despite what had happened, Agnos decided to find out what was going on. Suddenly, the young master confessed that the teacher was the same as all the others, the maids, the butler, who serve the master and work in the palace. Agnes asked which others he was talking about, and the young gentleman said that in the end all adults are the same and have only one thing on their minds. Despite her clothes being covered in red paint and her hands stinging with pain, Agnes gathered her courage and wanted to listen to this boy. She knelt down in front of him so that she could be on the same level with the child, and gently took his hands, trying to understand what was happening to him. Tamati believed that all adults were the same for him, and Agnes was no different from anyone else, but he had never said that before. With tears in his eyes, the boy asked if people really needed money that badly, since Agnes herself told the maids that she was doing all this for money. Now he was sure that the teacher did not want to communicate with him, but she had to, since this was her job, and Agnes was perplexed as to where the boy got this information from. He angrily shouted that he heard everything. The maid pronounced his words and said that she was broke and that was why she came here, because of the promised good salary. Disappointment boiled in the young gentleman's soul, and he did not understand why Agnes was obliged to deal with him, but he was sure that she did everything solely for the sake of earning money. Now Agnes didn't know who had said such a thing in front of the child, but it seemed that her attempt to answer the maid's annoying questions had led to exactly that. Touching the boy gently, she couldn't tell him the real reason, but she decided to talk to him sincerely and asked what he wanted to hear from her. The lady admitted that she really came to earn money, but teaching is her job, but she didn't know who Tamati was talking about now, but one thing was clear: this man works in the estate. Agnes also stated that she does get paid for her work as a teacher, and she cannot deny it, but that is not the reason for her communication with the young gentleman. The boy began to have a real hysteria, because since his mom and dad died, everyone behaved the same for him, and Bane was the first person who accepted him, and this number also included Agnes. He was even worried about Uncle Ethan, who looked irritated and said he only took him because he had to. That's why Tamati showed up now. Agnes is exactly the same. She says to his face that she likes him, but behind his back she calls him a diva. We assure him that this is her job. At that moment, the heroine understood how lonely this boy was, since he continued to hope that someone would take care of him. Sitting in red paint, she continued to listen to him attentively, but Tamati shouted that if it was about money, then she should immediately get out of here and no longer look at him as if he was a sweet and good boy. All this was clear to the teacher, and if Tamati really wanted her to leave, he would have acted completely differently. But with his little hand he held her nightgown, covered in paint, and with all his might he tried to open his soul, feeling that she could understand and help him. The boy cried bitterly, wiping away his tears with his hands, and this was the first time he trusted so much and told everything that had been accumulating in his little soul for a long time. Agnes asked in a gentle voice why he had splashed paint, since it was likely that neither the nightgown nor the bed linen would come out clean. She hugged the boy warmly and admitted that it would have been better to just talk, as he had just done, without any cruel jokes. These were Tamati's first hugs. He felt strange, but this warmth was so pleasant that he could not stop hugging the teacher. Agnes understood that this paint could get into her eyes and leave irreversible consequences, so she asked Tamati if he really didn't like it that much. But the boy admitted that he really liked the teacher and it was mutual, and there was some truth in the maid's words because Agnes came here to earn money. The point was that she could have worked elsewhere if she wanted, but she agreed to work with a child who had been rejected by all the teachers. And despite the quarrels between them, she still continued to be here and support him in the most difficult moments. The girl's cheeks were bright red, but despite this she smiled sweetly and asked how she could leave such a nice student. A storm of emotions splashed in his eyes, fear of possible punishment, but most importantly, deep sadness, which he had tried for so long to hide under a mask of indifference. There was more than just pity or sympathy in that embrace, but genuine understanding and support. It was a sign that he was not alone in his struggle, that there was someone willing to listen and accept him for who he was. She saw in this not just a prank but a cry for help, clumsily veiled under an absurd accident, but still did not understand why he chose the strongest paint. Agnes couldn't sleep that night. She felt like she could pass out at any moment, and she couldn't send Timati away when he finally opened up to her. Weakness overcame the girl, but the heroine tried to pull herself together because she definitely couldn't faint right now. But as soon as her eyes began to slowly close, she saw the blurry silhouette of the Duke in his nightgown, who for some reason opened the door to her room. Agnes felt her vision becoming blurry, and she completely lost control of her body, about to collapse onto the floor right then and there. It was like a moment from a fairy tale, but Ethan caught the lady before she could fall to the floor with a thud, completely exhausted from what was happening. He held her in his arms and looked at the young master, who, as usual, was acting too arrogantly. The young man merely stated that if he had not been there at the right moment, Agnes would have simply collapsed to the floor, covered in paint, the smell of which spread throughout the entire estate. Agnes had several sisters in her family who constantly insisted that she shouldn't put so much pressure on herself, calling her a stupid girl. They asked her to live her own life. I assure you that she will not be able to constantly take care of her parents, and life is so fleeting, and even the engagement is already broken off. It was time for Agnes to get married, but she insisted that everything was fine because she could not abandon her parents, continuing to tirelessly take care of them. The sisters were sure that the girl would still pay for her kindness and sing their words as soon as she would have that very moment that would change her life. If the heroine had left her job, no one would have paid for her father's medical expenses because the sisters did not help at all, using marriage as an excuse. While unconscious, Agnes saw her sisters in her visions, as well as the grown-up Timati, who asked her not to look down on him, but to look him in the eye. The boy told her that he hated it when people looked down on him. He wanted to kill people who reminded him of his wonderful uncle. He always looked down on Timati, as if he were a nobody, but Agnes in her visions asked why Timati himself did not admit this to his uncle. She saw Timati as an adult with great pain in his soul, who was sure that his uncles did not care at all about his words and his feelings. Agnes was sure that a father who could talk to his children like a normal person was absolutely necessary for his children. In this vision, Timati was already a grown-up young man who still held deep pain in his soul and was sure that this was not what was needed to raise children. The Duke and Timati spoke the same words, and they sounded so familiar, and she definitely heard them from the former Marquis, but suddenly the girl opened her eyes and did not understand where she was, and her whole face was incredibly pinched with pain. The first thing she did was look around to see that she was not blind and that her eyes were fine, and that the Duke was sitting next to her. Losing her sight because of a childish prank would have been simply terrible, because the heroine understood that people would not even be able to sympathize with her. A voice told her that her vision was fine, and at that moment she realized that Ethan himself was sitting on her bed. He reported that the doctor said the rash would go away if the ointment was applied correctly, and a frightened Agnes jumped up in bed and asked what the Duke was doing there. Timati Reynolds was under his care, and the young man admitted this, fully aware of his responsibility. This means that he is also responsible for what happened, and the boy's guilt also lies with him because Agnes could simply have gone blind. Was he really there all this time? But the young man confessed so that the lady would not come up with terrible ideas, and he only recently arrived since the doctor was here a minute ago. She was lucky that she didn't get worse. The consequences could have been much more serious, and the doctor also confirmed that the situation could have been much worse. Ethan admitted that if Agnes wanted to quit, he was not going to stop her, and promised to make sure the girl received decent compensation. But to the Duke's great surprise, the teacher had no intention of quitting, no matter what, and she even refused compensation. Ethan had assumed Agnes would say something similar, but he honestly didn't understand why, after everything that had happened, she was willing to stay here with Timothy. And why is she so desperate to still work here, despite the fact that the little devil almost took her eyes off by pouring caustic paint on them? Agnes understood that no one would understand her anyway, and she shouldn't put too much pressure on herself, although now she felt simply terrible. If she said that she simply wanted to change the future, the Duke would laugh and think she was crazy. Duke Ethan, who had maintained an impeccable distance up to this point, suddenly broke with social convention by approaching Lady Agnes. Ethan looked deep into her eyes, a look that penetrated the mask of politeness, a look full of questions, longing, and perhaps budding recognition. There was neither the usual detachment nor arrogant contempt in his gaze, only deep longing, unquenchable thirst, and barely perceptible entreaty. In these dark pools she seemed to see a reflection of her own soul, just as wounded and lonely. Surprise, mixed with alarm, flashed in Agnes's eyes, but the Duke suddenly said that he was very glad because Agnes had not inhaled paint fumes. Carefully removing his hand, he asked the teacher to try to rest. He himself was forced to go on important business. As they parted, he warned her that if she wanted to report anything, she should pass it on to Carlo's assistant, who would immediately convey the information to him. Lady Agnes stood frozen, unable to take her eyes off his, captivated by the unexpected display of his strange feelings. While Ethan was feeling confused during fencing practice, his partner, an experienced fencer, immediately noticed the change. His partner was Tristan, the crown prince of the Meyer Empire, and when the Duke didn't hear his words, he realized that the gentleman was probably too relaxed, since he was in the clouds during sparring. The young man was not one to chatter to distract his opponent, but this time he actually noticed a change in the cold-blooded Duke's mood. The blade of the sword seemed heavy, his movements awkward and constrained. He missed his target, his lunges were sluggish and predictable. Ethan tried to brush it off to say it was okay, but under Tristan's intense gaze his composure wavered. He even refused to continue sparring, saying that he was not in the mood today. And I understand that the Duke was behaving too strangely. After all, even his lunge, which now turned out to be insanely clumsy, was not at all difficult, but the Duke could not cope with even the easiest technique today. The sword fell from his hands, and Tristan declared that the training was over for today, and he wondered when he would see the Duke defeated. Picking up the sword that had accidentally fallen from his hands, the Duke admitted that his partner had rather bad taste and didn't know how to joke at all. Ethan insisted on continuing the sparring, but Tristan refused, finding his overconfidence too terrible. It seemed like they couldn't possibly compare their bad tastes, but Tristan was sure the training had been fun, otherwise it would have been completely pointless. But Tristan knew he was a more experienced swordsman than the Duke. Tristan stated that it seemed that someone had come to see him again today and was interested in what the honorable gentleman would do about it today. Ethan had absolutely no choice, and Tristan's cousin appeared behind him, and he simply couldn't stop her. It was Dahlia Martinez who tirelessly showed up for training, while Tristan was sure it was time for the Duke to gently brush her off. The lady was crazy about Master Ethan, and every time Tristan trained with him, she would show up again and again to at least get a glimpse of him. Dahlia admitted that she was incredibly happy, because lately she and the Duke of Battenberg had been seeing each other more and more often. The Duke understood that this was not a coincidence at all, and the girl knew when he came to training, and specially came at that time. Dahlia beamed with happiness as she looked at the Duke, calling herself simply a very lucky girl, because their meeting, in her opinion, was definitely a coincidence. Looking at the Duke as if he were a deity, she considered him the object of her adoration, those blue, heavenly eyes from which she could not take her eyes off. Tristan, looking at all this, understood the awkwardness of the situation and only silently looked first at her cousin, then at the Duke. Trying to somehow save his partner, he declared that he and the Duke needed to hurry to a very important meeting. Ethan first heard about some important meeting, while you will become a whisper so that he just quietly tries to help him and he should not show it. Dahlia was left standing alone, perplexed, because she had not managed to communicate with the Duke, who she came to see every day. Tristan asked if the Duke was really not interested at all, since Dahlia could make a wonderful bride, but the young man was not attracted to her at all. Tristan insisted that it was time for the Duke to think about an heir, and also time to start a family, but Ethan was sure that Tristan should not interfere in his personal life. After all, he could simply adopt a smart child from a side branch of the family, while Tristan was sure that the Duke, with such an attitude, could die alone. Ethan asked if he should play with his cousin and then throw her away, although he wasn't even remotely interested in that. Tristan was puzzled why a young man in his prime had absolutely no interest in girls. If the alternative for him was to end his life like his sister, then the Duke wished to grow old and die alone, understanding his fate. Tristan probably wanted to talk to his friend about personal matters, so he asked the gentleman to stop and give him some time. Tristana was very worried about how Greta's son was doing because the whole empire was talking about this boy. But turning around, the young man only coldly replied that he was fine and there was no need to worry about him. On the one hand, Tristan was glad to hear this, but on the other hand, he understood all the pain and bitterness of the loss of his family that lay on the shoulders of the master. He asked me to convey his greetings to his nephew, realizing that the boy had suddenly been left without parents and was probably having a hard time. Dahlia said that she could raise her husband's nephew as her own child, and Tristan told the Duke about this in case he needed help. The Duke had vague thoughts of one day marrying, but something changed his mind. His sister Greta, the daughter of the Battenberg family, who was known for her incredible beauty and elegance, and also her talent in fencing. Since he was a child, his sister taught Ethan how to fence, and always told him that when he attacked, he should always take the first step with his left foot. The little brother did everything exactly the same as Greta did at his age, but the young man angrily asked her never to compare his sister to himself. Greta just smiled and asked if the young gentleman was really so upset when he was told that he looked incredibly like his sister. He wanted to never be compared to his sister and asked her not to think that she would win again just because he gave in to her last time in sparring. Young Ethan dreamed of the day when he would defeat his sister, but she had already defeated him in sword fights 6 times. Greta joined the Imperial Guard with her brother and achieved excellent results, although he did not want to admit it, but she was someone worth learning from. But the meeting with Marquis Reynolds suddenly changed her. Greta, who fell head over heels in love with the gentleman, suddenly became incredibly stupid. After her marriage, the Duke inherited the title and was buried under work, and after the wedding, he never saw his sister, but judging by the letters they exchanged, she was doing well. But then, 8 years later, he again saw Greta, his own sister, lying in a coffin, and Mr. Tamati, the son of Lady Greta, came under his care. That day, the boy had absolutely no idea what was happening, where his mother had gone, and why he now had to live with a stranger. Looking at Tamati for the first time, the Duke realized that this boy was very similar to the Marquis because he was simply a copy of his father. After the funeral, Ethan asked the young man to follow him. Ethan gathered his nephew, whom he saw then for the first time, not out of a feeling of sympathy or kindness. The Marquis and Marchioness of Reynolds died in a fall from their horse while hunting on their estate, and he was informed of this immediately after his sister's death. A whole year had already passed, and the Duke's sister, who rode a horse incredibly well, suddenly died after falling off her horse while hunting, and it was the most stupid death. All this seemed incredibly absurd and very funny to the Duke, because how could circumstances that seemed completely unrealistic have developed in such a way? The hunting ground where Greta died belonged to the Reynolds house, and no one knew what really happened there. If the Duke had not taken Timati, everything would have gone to the one who killed his sister, including the property and rights that Timati would have to inherit. So all this time the young man dreamed of finding the criminal. At that moment, Agnes entered his office and admitted that she had been waiting for the gentleman all this time because she wanted to discuss something with him, but even Johann's attempts to stop her were unsuccessful. The Duke prepared to listen attentively, and Agnes assured him that she was working hard, but anyway, she asked if the Duke was going to go away anywhere. Ethan didn't understand the point of the question, and the teacher suspected that since he didn't say no, she might take it as a yes. The doctor forced the teacher to take 5 days off, although she insisted that she was completely fine and ready to begin lessons with Timati. All the time, she would think about how Timati was living without her, and she could not just imagine how he even ate alone, worrying terribly about him. The Duke was sure that this was not something that the lady should worry about, but Agnes wanted to convince him otherwise and used subtle methods. But for some reason, instead of answering her calmly, the young man looked in her direction without looking away. He probably realized that Agnes was up to something, and he said these words only in order to quickly return to Timati and resume work. He noticed her frightened look, which he had seen earlier, and Agnes admitted that the Duke was absolutely right, but Timati was behaving simply terribly at the table. Therefore, with pity in her eyes, she asked for help so that while she was gone, the Duke could have dinner with Timati, at least just today, but the young man insisted he was incredibly busy. Dinner took only an hour, and the gentleman was not so free as to waste a whole hour on something useless like dinner with his nephew. He asked if the teacher had any more requests and she could go to her room and rest in peace. But Agnes looked incredibly upset, knowing full well that the young gentleman needed attention, care, and support nearby more than ever. She was still standing near the Duke's table, waiting for him to agree, but the young man persistently asked her to leave. She wanted to do everything she could to get the master to help her, and for Ethan, the deal only worked when it was beneficial to both parties, but he would get nothing in return from the dinner. The teacher asked him, how about satisfying the request for compensation, and perhaps it could be beneficial to both parties. The Duke wondered if the scratch on her cheek was worth his time, since every minute of his day was scheduled with important matters. It wasn't the injury that was the issue, it was the master's high sense of responsibility, and that was exactly what Agnes was trying to teach the clueless Ethan. The lady stubbornly insisted on her opinion, and the Duke noticed that this girl had a gift for speaking and was ready to achieve anything. Agnes asked him to think about it because it was a good offer, and earlier he himself said that he would take responsibility for Timothy's mistake. The girl's persistence won out, and Ethan merely quietly stated that he understood her opinion perfectly well and that this was enough of this talk. After all, if she says one more word, he will pretend that none of this happened, and the teacher will be immediately fired from the next day. Agnes instantly shut her mouth and obediently fulfilled the master's request, leaving his office. Still, she managed to get what she wanted, and she was the first girl who could negotiate with a young man who never agreed to any conditions other than his own. Having closed the door of his office, the teacher was incredibly happy that she had managed to achieve what she wanted, and the young gentleman would no longer have dinner alone. It took longer than she thought, but the main thing is that she succeeded and was able to take advantage of the Duke's debt that she had promised earlier. At that moment, the butler, who had given the girl leave that morning but had no idea what she was doing there, found her in the corridor. She even left her luggage behind because she was in a hurry to talk to the Duke and simply couldn't leave like that without finishing important business. Carlo understood that the lady had come to see his lordship before leaving, declaring that she was truly hopeless and stubborn. The corridor was too noisy, and the butler asked to take care of the disturber of the piece, but now the heroine behaved in exactly the same way, although she didn't care at all. In a way, Carlo considered her much worse, because in the end the young gentleman was not harmed, but since the teacher arrived, there had not been a single quiet day. He didn't mean to say that it was bad. He just really hoped that the lady would take care of herself, and the carriage that arrived for the girl was already ready. The butler reminded that the lady was still a patient who needed bed rest and care for herself, not for other people. Carlo was a good person, and Agnes really wanted Timothy to have a caring person next to him who would understand the soul of a small child. She didn't know if anything would change in that case, so she asked if she could see Timothy and talk to him a little before leaving. But the butler categorically refused, and Agnes had not seen Timothy since the day he poured paint on her, although she would very much have liked to see him before leaving. During the 5 days that she would be away, she did everything in her power for the estate, and getting into the carriage, she went home with a sense of fulfilling her duty as a lady. Having thanked the butler for his help, Agnes promised to see him in 5 days, and now she could only pray that everything would be well with the young master. She had been thinking about finding out about the current situation for a long time, but now was actually the perfect time to finally find out. First, she was going to go home and talk to her mother, because if she thought about it, the heroine felt that she had done something terrible to her. On the day she returned to the past, she tried to catch her breath, unable to understand where the dream ended and the new reality began. In fear, she touched her neck, because just a second ago her head had been cut off, and she then found herself in the house where she had lived before. When Agnes woke up after her rebirth, her mother entered the room with frightened eyes and asked why her daughter looked so worried. That day the girl overslept some important event, and she looked at her mother with such eyes as if she was seeing her for the first time in her life. The lady noticed that her daughter looked very bad, as if she had had an incredibly terrible nightmare, and we still couldn't breathe from the terrible sensations. Then she immediately fainted, and her mother, who had died many years ago, suddenly appeared in front of her, and the girl's emotions were quite understandable. As soon as she woke up, she kept asking if she was really alive and what day it was, and she must have really scared her, asking such things after she woke up. Driven by the idea of changing the future, the heroine immediately got a job in the Duke's house, and that day her mother probably thought her daughter had gone crazy. When she woke up, the girl realized that at that time she was only 22 years old, and a happy future life filled with colorful events awaited her. The heroine did not remember what she was like at 22 because her murder had occurred about 14 years ago, and now, as she rode in the carriage, the lady calmly thought about finally seeing her family. She had just started working then, and until her parents died, she was constantly busy, partly because the teacher needed money, but continuous work helped her forget about home. At home, she always had to calm her mother down when she cried and constantly apologize for it, not understanding what she had done wrong again. At that time, her feelings for her parents faded, but she loved them immensely, so she did everything possible to support them and make their life comfortable. It was that very terrible day when she found herself at her mother's grave, but for some reason the heroine did not have a drop of regret. Every penny she earned was given to her parents, and she had already saved enough money to give them a decent funeral. Of course, there were days when she missed them incredibly, but because she had been forced to support them alone for a long time, the feeling of freedom became stronger. And perhaps that was why she felt terribly lost now that she was back next to her mother, mindlessly picking at her plate with her spoon. She didn't know how to come face to face with the younger version of her mother, and the heroine felt as if she wasn't in her home at all, although everything around was familiar. The mother saw a scratch on his face and became worried that there might be a scar, asking what kind of family had brought the teacher to such a state. Agnes admitted that this accident had nothing to do with the student, and that it was a pure accident in which the family had no involvement. Mother was worried. Even if it happened by accident, her daughter could get hurt, and the Earl of Westwick's family treated her well, but now she suddenly ended up in another place. Agnes said the family paid better, and they gave her 5 days off for her minor wound, but her mother was still worried about her daughter's marriage. She worked as a live-in teacher, but in her opinion she should have looked for a noble husband, but Agnes did not plan to get married. Preferring to live alone, the heroine felt that it was much easier and calmer for her, and she did not need a husband or a wedding at all. Having said these words, the heroine felt awkward, because all her sisters had already acquired husbands, and she asked how long ago they had been there. According to Mother, both sisters had come in quite recently and for a short time, but for some reason, Mother said this with great regret. She looked more lost, fragile, and awkward than the heroine remembered, and now the Agnos was glad that she could see her again. Mother said that her sisters left quite quickly, and it seemed that they were busy, but in reality they probably just didn't care at all about their family. Agnes asked to call her sisters because they did not live so far away, and Mother became worried that something urgent had happened. And since his lordship was unmarried, the matter concerned the Duke of Battenberg, the heroine wanted to know whether there was an engagement concluded a generation ago. She wanted to find out the details of who would become the future Duchess, so that she could understand what kind of lady would be next to Tim, about whom she was incredibly worried. After all, her sisters must know all the gossip of the Empire, and she can certainly find out information from them. For some reason, at that moment, Mother became incredibly happy, and perhaps she thought that the teacher wanted to become a future Duchess. At that moment, Agnes had just taken a sip of water, but she could not resist her mother's opinion and accidentally spat all the water right in her face. Whatever the mother thought or imagined, her daughter confidently declared that all of this was absolutely not true, and she has absolutely no intention of taking the place of the Duchess, and she needs this information for a completely different reason, which she cannot yet talk about. Mother assured that her daughter could be honest with her. She probably saw the venerable Duke and became interested in him, so she wanted to know more details about him. Agnes tried to prove that this was not the case, but too much time had passed and she had completely forgotten what kind of person her mother was. Even in her last moments of life, she hoped that her daughter would marry a noble gentleman, and that only in this would her true happiness lie. Everyone knew that the Duke of Battenberg was very handsome, and the mother asked her daughter not to be shy and finally tell the whole truth, because every young lady of her age had fallen in love with the Duke at least once. Her daughter was too picky and never looked at the same man twice until this very moment. Mother considered the Duke an excellent man, although he rarely appeared in high society, but often attended events with the Crown Prince, and she had no idea how many girls desired him. And this means that she could say with complete confidence that this gentleman definitely has no one, because everything would already be known. Mother told her daughter that the previous Duke and Duchess died quite early, but the heroine only now learned this information. At that moment, she realized that the Duke of Battenberg had lost both his parents as a child, and then a short time later his sister had died tragically, and it was terrible. Therefore, for many years, many ladies have tried to win the Duke's favor, but he is often on the road and constantly busy with his work. Agnes asked if that meant that no one had ever heard of the Duke being close to anyone or even dating any girls. She thought with horror that in his past life Ethan had died all alone, but why of all people had the Duke ended up in such a position and not continued his line? In this case, her plan to create a good impression of Tamati and the future Duchess, the desire to give him home warmth and stability, will completely fail. Mother heard that the young man was close only to His Highness the Crown Prince. The heroine could not believe that the Duke really had no friends and not a single woman. As far as she knew, the young man had no relationships with anyone. He also had no friends at all, and the Duke's life was spent in complete solitude. When Agnes heard that the gentleman really didn't have any good friends, she couldn't believe it. But if you think about it, that's true. It feels like he hates people regardless of their gender, but the way he treats Johann or her is horrible and rude. Mother said that now everything suddenly became clear to her, but Agnes, thinking about it, did not understand what exactly she meant. Mother was sure that in order to interest her daughter, a person must not only be beautiful in appearance, but also have a kind heart and a huge soul. Agnes sadly realized that such a man would probably have many admirers, and there was no chance that the man she was destined to be with would choose her. The heroine began to worry that with all these conversations, she had only upset her mother and asked her for forgiveness, but now she wanted to tell her the truth. The heroine decided to go upstairs to her room so that after a difficult conversation with her mother, she could finally be alone in her own home. She understood that now her mother could burst into tears again, assuring that she had in no way upset her and that she just wanted to be alone. Agnes didn't complain about her life, she didn't complain about her job, and she never complained about any of her problems. She finally found herself in her room, where she found herself that day after being reborn, and now the girl's head was simply bursting with thoughts. But now she absolutely did not want to think about her life, did not want to think about finding a husband or anything else like that, which irritated her incredibly. Before returning to the past, she was completely satisfied with how everything turned out, but she still had the biggest regrets, and even if she died and went back, she still didn't have enough courage to do some things. Now the teacher just wanted to focus on teaching Tamati, so as not to fill her head with unnecessary thoughts that were disturbing her soul. Having been at home for literally just a few hours, the heroine felt that she already wanted to leave as soon as possible, because it was becoming unbearably hard for her here. That same evening, the Duke fulfilled Agnes's request and went to dinner with his nephew, as she had asked. It was the Duke and Tamati's first dinner, and the room was completely silent, except for the quiet clink of cutlery. The young gentleman dined with incredible caution, holding a fork awkwardly in his hands, afraid to even move. He felt as if he was going to suffocate, and the boy was very afraid of doing something wrong so that the Duke would not get angry. He didn't understand what was going on around him, why his uncle suddenly decided to have dinner with him, because this had never happened before. Also in the dining room were the Duke's butler and assistant Johann, who also did not understand what was happening. Everyone knew that this was definitely Agnes's work, and no one doubted it at all. Even Tamati himself was absolutely sure of it. The young gentleman was a little dissatisfied because he certainly didn't ask the teacher to let his uncle have dinner with him, and if he had time for such nonsense, she could have simply given up on the trip and stayed together. During dinner, Tamati was not busy with food, but with thoughts that he shouldn't have been so stubborn and should have just gone to her, and maybe she wouldn't have left. That day, Tamati was very ashamed, so he cried like a girl, and every day he thought about this act, which he wanted to erase from his memory. He was sure that the teacher would definitely return the next day, but who would have thought that she would actually suffer from the caustic paint? The boy was worried because he didn't even apologize before she left, and the teacher simply left without saying goodbye or a word. Carefully holding his fork in his hands, he slowly brought the piece to his mouth and chewed it diligently, while the Duke also felt awkward. He didn't even know what to talk about with his nephew, and he held the spoon awkwardly in his hands as he slowly ate his dinner. Looking at his uncle, Tamati felt like all the food had gotten stuck in his throat. He had absolutely no idea what this man was thinking about. He might think that he would be welcomed at the local dinner, but Tamati was sure that his uncle hated him anyway, especially after what happened. But given all this, he didn't understand why he agreed to have dinner with him, since there were people in Reynolds' house who could take care of him. Timati was worried that he shouldn't have gone through this horror, but it wasn't like he had a voice or a choice. The Duke slowly finished his dinner, but at that moment the boy became so excited that the fork he was holding tightly in his hands flew out and fell on the floor. This was considered bad form, and it is quite possible that Tamati could have been punished for this, as if he had absolutely no table manners and no manners. The ringing of a fork resounded throughout the dining room, but neither the Duke nor Tamati said a word, and the boy's whole body trembled. Johann and the butler exchanged glances, but neither of them said anything, because none of them understood what they needed to do now. The Duke looked at his nephew with a cold gaze, but now he had no intention of scolding him for his lack of manners. But Tamati, having already imagined all this in his head, was preparing for the most angry quarrels that could only happen in his mind. He sat in his place holding his breath, and the Duke, standing up from the table, declared that everything had happened exactly as the teacher had said. Without a word, Ethan walked out of the dining room and slammed the door behind him, leaving the boy sitting there in bewilderment. At that moment, the saddest feelings came over him, and the baby did not know what to do with himself, because even a piece of food would not go down his throat. Clenching his little fists, he was ready to burst into tears right there on the spot, from the despair and misunderstanding that he constantly encountered when meeting his uncle. He tried to hold back from bursting into tears in front of the entire dining room, not understanding what his fault was, but this kind of thing happened all the time when he was talking to his uncle. The next morning, Agnes woke up in a terrible state and realized that everything she did would not help at all. The lady was confidently determined to run away from home, despite all the doctor's prohibitions and her 5-day vacation. After all, no matter how she tried to improve relations with her family, the conversation with her father was no different, and he also insisted that his daughter needed to get married. None of her parents wanted to hear that Agnes would sort out her personal life on her own, and her parents probably thought she was acting strangely. The heroine didn't think that going back to the past could have side effects, and the future she wanted to fix didn't include her parents. She had previously felt it vaguely, but now, going back 14 years, she was sure that something was clearly wrong in her family, and her parents had shifted all the responsibility for earning money onto their youngest daughter. Her father needed to take medication, and although her mother was not in good health, the heroine understood that she could do something if she wanted to. It was all quite strange, and she only realized it after her revival, and now she had no idea how to fix her relationship with her parents. In any case, looking in the mirror, she realized that the fashion of 14 years ago was simply awful, but she made an important decision and was going to leave home. Agnes felt that if she stayed in this house any longer, she would simply suffocate under her parents' persistence, and this morning she quietly descended the stairs. She had no chance to talk to Earl Westwick, but this was just a great chance to see him. But suddenly Mother showed up. Someone came to their house to see her. This turned out to be even more unexpected because no one could have appeared here this morning. When she went out into the corridor, she was even more surprised because on the threshold stood the butler from the ducal house, Carlo, who said that he was very sorry about his sudden visit. Agnes began to worry that Tamati was causing trouble again, but the butler told her that they had tried to sort it out without her, but they had failed. Therefore, the presence of the teacher is simply necessary at the ducal estate, and she needs to go right now to sort everything out. The mother did not understand what was happening. She imagined that her daughter had gotten herself into something serious, and the daughter asked her not to worry, because the butler of the house where she works had arrived. Everything turned out much better than Agnes expected, and she confessed to her mother that she was simply needed by her student and asked her to tell her father that she was very sorry to leave without saying goodbye. The mother, with a worried face, asked her to take care of herself because she did not expect at all that her daughter would leave her home so soon. But Agnes was only glad because just this morning she was going to run away from here without the possibility of staying here again. Sitting in the carriage, the butler asked if Agnes had told him about her new job, but she didn't say a word, because the mere mention of the Duke of Battenberg puts her in such a state, and it's hard to imagine what will happen if she says that she works there. The butler apologized for disturbing her during her vacation because only one night had passed, and he had already urgently come to pick her up. The butler said that after dinner, everything suddenly changed dramatically, and Timati asked about Agnes all night, but Leda thought that Timati became calmer. As soon as she heard about the dinner, she immediately suspected that his lordship might have said something wrong and offended the young master. But the Duke said practically nothing. After the boy dropped the fork, he only clarified that the teacher had said so, after which he went to his room. Agnes wondered what exactly she had said then, perhaps something about Timati being very lonely, or the Duke had completely misunderstood her. She knew that Timati's table manners were far from ideal, and she wondered if the Duke had said something like that during dinner with his only nephew. Perhaps he took her words literally, and the butler did not understand at all, so he asked Agnes if she had any ideas about what could have happened between them. It seems the teacher understood perfectly well what was going on, and the Duke completely misunderstood everything and simply offended the boy with his behavior. She was absolutely sure of it. It was precisely the young gentleman's manners that were the problem, and she was going to give the Duke a real dressing down. As soon as she appeared in the estate, the young master immediately broke a glass vase in front of her and angrily looked the teacher straight in the eyes. The vase flew too close, and the boy shouted what the lady had said to him that made his uncle behave like that. She understood that Timati was upset, and he asked her to confess what exactly she had told his uncle and why he had left after dinner. Agnes tried to calm the young gentleman down while the boy was indignant about who she thought she was and who gave her the right to interfere in his life like that. Timati said that the teacher shouldn't have pulled such tricks because he already knows perfectly well that his uncle hates him. The teacher saw incredible pain and despair in the boy's eyes, and he again found himself in a state where no one understood him. Now he really looked like a little devil, and he really wanted Agnes to confess honestly, but if that wasn't the case, let her at least lie. The teacher stood there in bewilderment, seeing the young gentleman's disappointment. I understand that she probably made a huge mistake. Timati is not just a child who needs affection. A whole year has passed since he arrived here. And this year is more than enough time for a child who has lost his parents to receive deep emotional wounds that he cannot cope with on his own. Agnes said she didn't know for sure, but the boy was sure that the teacher knew everything perfectly well. She asked him if he knew what the Duke of Battenberg felt for his nephew, and wanted to say that this was precisely the fact that none of them knew. Perhaps the Duke does not know what kind of person Timati really is, and she tried to convey this to the young gentleman, who was simply at the height of anger. Timati's behavior seemed to be the same as on the first day of their acquaintance. He asked if she had just called his uncle a fool. But this was not the case at all, and Agnes wanted to say that if you don't know a person well, you should talk to him so that you can finally understand each other. Timati asked to forget about it and just stop interfering, and warned that if the teacher did something similar, he would never forgive her. He assured her that his uncle hated him, and he hated him back, and the little boy promised that once he grew up, they would no longer have to hate each other. That was the problem, and the heroine did all this just to change the future, but all she heard was the loud screams of the little devil. The heroine thought deeply and closed her eyes, and the boy began to get even angrier. She sat down in front of him again and asked him to call her teacher or Agnes, and she promised to think about his words. But she asked to wait a little and not make such a weighty decision, because what happened yesterday will never happen again. Timati really wanted to believe her words, but his little soul was raging and torn apart by his uncle's inexplicable betrayal. Agnes wasn't going to pay attention to the boy's behavior, and admitted that he could have simply called her instead of throwing and breaking things around the estate. After all, he could have been hurt by the shards of a broken vase, and even if he was angry about food, you can't throw things. Timati understood perfectly well that he was rich and could do whatever he wanted with his things, but Nos assured him that this house did not yet belong to him. But even despite her words, he only replied that his uncle was richer than him, and he could afford to buy any of the broken things at any time. He called Agnes petty and didn't understand why she would get upset about something like that, since they were just things. Even when the little devil was so angry, he still calmed down very quickly because the child was still a child. And just because Timati once cried in her arms, the teacher still had no intention of letting down her guard, and grabbing the boy, threw him over her fragile shoulder. Timati felt embarrassed, and the teacher angrily declared that she had heard that the young gentleman had not slept all last night. His heart may have opened a little, but Agnes had rushed and made a mistake that made him mistrust her again, and she was going to fix that. She knew she had to be more careful and strategic from now on, suggesting to the young master that he finish for today and hold the classes tomorrow. Putting the boy on the floor, Timati indignantly declared that both his parents were tall. Agnes laughed that Timati was the shortest of them. The boy's anger gradually gave way to other feelings, and after the teacher carried him on her shoulder through the entire corridor, he calmed down a little. The boy angrily entered his room and slammed the door so hard that Agnes was almost knocked over by the loud impact. Still, the young gentleman had the most unpleasant character, but Agnes was perfectly prepared for this. The teacher wished Timati sweet dreams in a gentle voice so that he would feel support and care. If you think about it, in the future, Timati grew up to be quite a tall young man, and the heroine decided to clean his room while he was sleeping. Although, according to her memories, he was an incredibly thin boy with light, tousled hair. Maybe that's why he turned out to be so fragile, and if you look into it, Timati was only 21 years old when he died at the hands of his uncle. A child who desperately wanted to be considered an adult without having a worthy example to follow grew up with a completely broken soul. The teacher decided to clean up the office, and it seemed that now she understood why everything turned out the way it did, and the boy's heart was completely broken. Understanding her enemy was a rather strange feeling, because having returned to the past, the heroine managed to meet little Timati and her killer. Timati wanted to grow up as quickly as possible. Even now he insisted that he was already quite grown up. But no matter how big your body is, if your mind has matured, no one will treat you as an adult, and the future Marquis was just like that. At 15, he created a huge scandal, an illegitimate pregnancy with 2 children. Everything turned into chaos. Because of this, he got illegitimate twins. And it was for this reason that he was exiled to the territory of the Marquis of Reynald, and there people began to treat him like an adult. But did he want this at that time? The teacher didn't know who his fiancée was, whether he had such an agreement, because if he married this girl, then children would certainly appear. Knowing that something like this would happen, she would pay more attention to gossip, because now Agnost couldn't even remember who his fiancé was. After being reborn, she thought she just needed to correct this little devil's behavior. But this was too naive, and the heroine still has a long way to go, but for now she has at least finished cleaning. She needed to improve Timati's relationship with the Duke, help him make friends, but she didn't understand how to convince Ethan that the boy needed communication. Despite the angry words of the young gentleman, who imagined himself to be an adult Marquis, she believed that everything would be exactly as she wanted. And now she needed to find out the name of the bride, but she had no idea how to do this. Agnes had a lot to find out, and a lot of things to do, and at that moment the girl realized that she was finished. The nephew, neglected by his uncle, will rebel in the future, and in order to avoid tragedy, she must explain something to the Duke. Tragedy may be inevitable, and in the future the Duke will kill him with his own hands, so for now he must treat the boy as family. It sounded absolutely crazy, and even Timati noticed during the lesson that the teacher had gone crazy. The boy was indignant when the teacher told him to read a book while she went about her own business. She asked to read it and talk about it later if something was unclear. She promised to explain, but Timati hated it when he didn't understand something. He carefully turned the pages of the textbook, delving into every line, and he was truly interested in learning. Although Timati was always grumbling, he was surprisingly focused and well-informed, and it seemed his parents had made an effort to educate him. History lessons should be boring, but Timati read the book on his own, wanting to understand everything before discussing the material with Agnes. This children's book had more text than pictures, but Timati still found it interesting, and this boy was incredibly smart. Watching Timati read, Agnes even wondered if the young gentleman was really a genius. Suddenly the boy stopped and told the teacher to put it away immediately, and she thought that he had suddenly become bored with the book. But Timati talked about her eyes. She looked at him too intently, and therefore he could not concentrate. The lady found it funny that the boy was nervous, and she decided to take a short walk, warning him that if he got lonely, he could just call her. Agnes burst out laughing, and Tamati, grabbing the textbook, shouted for the teacher to leave the room and not interfere with him reading. It all seemed too cute, and that was why Agnes enjoyed teaching so much. The butler found her in the corridor, asked if something had happened, and then she told him that she had simply given the young gentleman a little time. There were rumors that his lordship had gone somewhere, or you decided to find out if it was true. Carlo admitted that the Duke had been patient so far, but he was not at all interested in teaching Tamati, and if things continued, his reaction would be unexpected. The butler noticed that Agnes and the young gentleman were getting along and suggested that they simply continue their studies. But if something urgent happens, he will definitely hand it over to him personally, and the teacher asked if everything would go smoothly in that case. She was sure the problem would not go away, but Tamati was too smart a child. But the boy still continued to be capricious, and she asked the butler if he had ever thought about it. She knew that Tamati was being capricious for only one reason: he needed the attention of the Duke, an adult. If the two never get along, the child will become more stubborn and things will only get worse in the end. The heroine knew perfectly well the future of these two people, and then the Duke simply joined the rebellion. The butler admitted that, unfortunately, his lordship was busy, and he was not one of those whom Agnes could see simply at her own discretion. Looking out the window, Agnes saw the Duke standing below, which meant that his lordship had finally returned. He was indeed standing on the threshold of the estate with his master Tristan, but nothing was known of his arrival. Since the Duke returned completely unexpectedly, the butler hurried to meet him and greet the venerable gentleman. He ran down the stairs and, out of breath, stopped opposite the Duke, meeting my lord. Ethan warned him that he had a guest with him, but the young man was surprised why Agnes was standing next to the butler. Carlo said that the young gentleman insisted, and he had no choice but to return it yesterday, but unfortunately, he did not have time to inform the gentleman. Agnes thought it was just the perfect time to discuss something with the gentleman about Tamati. Tristan had never seen the girl there before, and asked Ethan to introduce them to each other. Tristan even noticed that the Duke seemed a little disappointed to see the teacher here. The gentleman asked the butler how many years he had been visiting this estate, and as it turned out, more than 10 years had passed. The young man cried out joyfully. Since so many years had passed, the Duke's people were also his people. But Ethan only looked haughtily at Mr. Tristan, while he rejoiced and smiled from ear to ear. The gentleman wondered if he really didn't want to introduce them to each other, and Agnes would never have thought so, but it seemed like the crown prince was standing in front of her. She didn't know what to do now. Maybe she should just leave, but according to etiquette, she had to greet him. The butler asked the teacher to return to the office, but Tristan realized that this was the same girl who was teaching Greta's son. He was the first to approach her and shake her hand, asking how she was doing and if the Duke's sister's son was doing well. No matter how much Tristan insisted, Ethan did not agree to introduce them to each other, despite his requests. Ethan just sighed heavily and wondered if the teacher had really come here to talk to him. He asked her to wait in the office, and Agnes understood that she could not disobey the master's order. Tristan acted like a mad child and wanted to go to the office with him, but the young man asked if he was busy. If he were busy, he certainly wouldn't be following the Duke around, and when it comes to Greta's son, nothing is more important. Agnes fully supported Tristan's words. That's exactly what she was talking about, and at first glance the crown prince seemed like a decent person. Unlike Ethan, Tristan seemed quite nice, and Agnes only wished the Duke was half as nice. Ethan stated that written reports were not enough to check the young master's progress in learning, and that something else was probably needed. The Duke had previously said he wanted to improve his relationship with his only nephew, and Agnes hoped the Duke would be involved in his studies as a guardian. She assured that the truth could help and asked the Duke to believe her words, but he was sure that the lady was mistaken, and there was nothing to improve here. For some reason, he looked at the teacher with distrust and thought that a typical swindler would have said exactly the same thing. Agnes didn't think the Duke would give in so easily, and her method didn't work, so she said that if the Duke distanced himself from his nephew, it would only get worse. She asked him what exactly he had said to him at dinner, but he simply repeated the teacher's words that he lacked table manners. Agnes's indignation knew no bounds because she said that he lacked manners compared to an adult. The Duke could not understand that this remark was like a dagger thrust at the young gentleman, and that Agnes only wanted him to simply praise him. The Duke remained cold in his words, but this time the teacher was strict and asked the gentleman to do it even if it was a lie. She knew perfectly well that if things continued like this, one day Tamati would turn down the wrong path. Perhaps he will cause problems with his future bride, and after his expulsion he may even join the rebellion. Agnes understood that in front of the crown prince she could not even think about rebellion, much less talk about it. She tried to prove to the Duke that in the future he might regret his behavior, but it would be too late. But he has already said this before, he never regrets anything, and even if this happens, it does not concern the teacher in any way. She knew that in order for Tamati to grow up properly, he needed the love and attention of his guardian, be it horse riding, even fencing, or something else. Agnes asked the Duke to get closer to his nephew, but he only replied that he could fire her at any moment. And if she had not understood this, she would hardly have dared to say it to the Duke's face, and she herself could have left at any time. But she was going to persuade the Duke until he changed his mind, and she was confident in her persistence. Ethan noticed that this girl did not give up easily, and on the other hand, she was glad that the young man understood this. Finally, their dialogue was over, and the butler suggested that they continue their conversation at the estate. It was the first time Tristan had seen Ethan talk so much, and he even looked like a man who might have an argument. After the conversation, the teacher ran to her office, not hearing anything, because now she had to return to Tamati. Out of breath, she opened the door, and the boy noticed that the teacher seemed to have run all the way here. Standing near the door, the girl could not catch her breath, and she did not have enough air, and it felt like her face was about to burn. Tamati even laughed. The teacher is absolutely out of shape, since she is out of breath after a short jog. She asked him to first live to her age, and the young gentleman was indignant. Did the teacher really want to say that he was small and frail? But he knew that he would soon grow up and become big, and even now he is sure that he is almost big. Agnes approached the young gentleman and replied sweetly that he was thinking correctly and that he would soon be as tall as she was. And in just a few years, the young gentleman will become much taller, wiser, and smarter. Tamati again caught the teacher's strange look, which always puzzled him. He wondered what Agnes had been doing to be so exhausted and still not fully recovered, even though she still said the obvious. He noticed that the wound was bothering her so much that the teacher couldn't even speak normally, and he wanted to know what she had been doing all this time. The young gentleman asked if the lady dared to go to his uncle to arrange a meeting between the teacher and the parent again. Agnes remained silent in response to this question. The young gentleman screamed because he asked her not to do this anymore, and his uncle did not give a damn about him. Such was Agnes's educational practice, even though she had to ignore the young master's words. She asked him not to misunderstand her, and she no longer wanted to leave him alone with his uncle, as had happened last time. She promised that the young gentleman would not suffer anymore, and she was very sorry that this happened, and Tamati wanted to stay away from him. Agnes admitted that the Duke simply didn't know how to get along with a child, despite the fact that he himself had once been a child. The lady wanted Tamati to be honest with her, and in some way the young gentleman understood his uncle's behavior. And if Ethan really didn't like him, Agnes promised to change her educational policy. Tamati called this conversation simply funny, because he knew that the teacher was completely incapable of lying. But Agnes did promise to change the training, admitting that she just wanted the young master to be happy. She carefully took his hand so that the young master would feel supported, but he still could not fully open his soul. He was just angry. Who was the teacher to say something like that? Who did she even think she was? Agnes asked him to tell the truth, and if he really hated the Duke, he just needed to say so and she would stop everything. This time Tamati thought about her words, because when she held his hands, he did not feel that she was lying now. Looking away, the boy sadly asked to do what the teacher wanted. After all, deep down inside, for some reason, he really hated that he had such an indifferent uncle. When Greta was alive, she was constantly with her little son, and one day he caught her writing a letter. That day, the boy asked if he could see what his mother had written. She wrote a letter to Uncle Ethan again, and when Tamati asked about him, she was glad that the boy remembered him, although they had never met. Greta always praised her brother and said what an amazing, kind person he was. The lady hugged her son with all her care and was happy that he was growing up to be a smart and handsome boy. Then the baby was incredibly happy because he was surrounded by the care and affection of his mother every day. She talked a lot about her brother, but Timati was still too young to understand that it was not easy to head the ducal house at such an age. Greta loved her brother very much, despite his rude nature, but he always treated his sister very well. For her, he was someone she was incredibly proud of, and she was even more proud of her little son Timati. Greta suggested that the boy write his uncle 1 or 2 lines, and each time she expected that her brother would write her back. That's exactly how Greta spoke about her brother, but when Timati stood before his cold eyes, he felt like a rabbit in front of a boa constrictor. The young gentleman hated one thing about his character more than anything else. The Duke never once tried to get to know him. Timati was sure that she didn't love him, but he just wanted to get at least a drop of attention. He just wanted to be recognized. He dreamed that his uncle would be proud, and that the young gentleman was in fact the son of his sister, the loving and caring Greta. The boy told his teacher about this, and she advised him to just continue doing what he had been doing, promising to take care of the rest. Agnes wanted Timati to simply trust her, no matter what, no matter his deep emotional pain and resentment towards his uncle. At that moment, Tristan and the Duke were in his office. The young man wondered why he had not called him as soon as he had such a funny man. Tristan had never seen anyone stand so confidently before his master, and even the Dolia he liked could barely say a word. Not to mention his knights, who were afraid of just one look from the Duke, which sent shivers down their spines. If I had said even a word to the Duke, he would certainly have answered her with joy, but it was precisely because of his gaze that she could not utter a word. To be honest, Tristan knew what Ethan was like before, but everyone around him had no idea. He was sure that someday Dahlia would gather the courage to speak to the Duke for the first time, but it was unlikely to happen soon. Tristan wondered if Ethan would ever tell him the teacher's name, since he still hadn't told him anything about her. The Duke took it as an order, but it was only a small request, and the master asked him if he really didn't want to do it. Tristan continued to joke and laugh, but the Duke remained cold and only looked at his friend with contempt. The Crown Prince realized that, judging by the girl's appearance, she was about 20 years old and very young. And in a squeaky voice, he asked if the Duke really wanted him to come up and find out her name personally. Ethan knew it was pointless to argue with Tristan, so he gave in and named Agnes May Graham. The gentleman had never heard this name before, the Duke said. She is the daughter of a baron. The young man noted that for a man who was resisting, he knew quite a lot about her, but Ethan insisted that he had learned about it by accident. He had learned this from the daily training reports for the last 2 weeks, and Tristan wondered if he had read them all. He burst out laughing when he heard the teacher lying in front of his door until he heard her report. Tristan laughed out loud, and he really liked this girl already, because there was something funny in her eccentricity. The Duke thought she was a strange woman, because it was not often that you saw a person with manure on her hands extending her hand for a handshake. At that time, the Duke even found it funny, and he told Tristan that on the day they first met, Agnes had actually been lying in the horse stable. The Crown Prince found the lady rather peculiar, but for some reason the Duke doubted that everything would end with him only learning her name. No matter how strange His Highness's tastes were, Ethan knew full well that this was simply impossible. He simply said her name, but for some reason it now bothered him incredibly, and the Duke couldn't figure out why. When Tristan was already rolling on the table laughing after listening to funny stories, he admitted that it was probably enough to be distracted from work. He asked what the Duke was hiding, and it probably concerned Greta's son, since the gentleman had been behaving very strangely lately. Tristan knew absolutely nothing. If he dug deeper, it would only anger Ethan. And the Crown Prince did not want to create problems for himself, much less spoil his relationship with his friend. Ethan admitted he had absolutely nothing to say about his sister's death, and Tristan suggested it probably wasn't an accident. The death from falling from a horse turned out to be simply ridiculous, and no one who knew her would have believed it. Tristan was disappointed, because Greta had been his childhood friend, and now everyone expected him to just turn a blind eye. But the Duke meant that continuing to pretend was the best help the Crown Prince could give him. The young man had been pretending for a whole year that nothing had happened, but it didn't seem like there had been any progress. For the Duke, even a small amount of progress was a result, and he was sure there was no need to rush, because after all, they had the hostage. Ethan believed that when the time came, these people would crawl out of their holes and show their murderous faces. He had just called his own nephew a hostage, and Tristan had declared that it was no wonder that the teacher looked upon the Duke as the villain of the century. There was a ball to be held soon, and the Crown Prince asked that he be sure to show up at the event and not to think of hiding in the security room again. Ethan categorically refused to appear at the ball, but Tristan warned him that strange rumors had already started. At this point, they decided to end their conversation, and Tristan was about to go to his palace, having found out everything he needed to know. He refused to accompany the Duke, saying that he had plenty of guards and did not need his help at all. The Crown Prince left the office, and the Duke was left alone with his thoughts deep in thought. But Tristan came back to say one last thing, and he thought Agnes was rather nice than weird. Time flew by very quickly for Agnes at the ducal estate. She spent 2 hours in class, and today it was time for her to get ready. The lessons lasted 4 hours a day, and every day the teacher was busy preparing for the lessons, but it was worth it. During today's lesson, Tamati was carefully underlining something in his textbook, and after finishing it, he gave it to the teacher. Looking at the pages of the book, Agnes simply gasped, not believing that the young gentleman could have done this. Tamati quickly solved everything they had learned today, and the teacher immediately praised the boy, who was confident in his intelligence. The boy couldn't focus on anything for long, but he quickly grasped everything on the fly, and thanks to this, he developed quickly. Hearing the praise, Tamati blushed and declared that there was nothing serious in these examples, just children's games. The young gentleman behaved like a child who was finally happy that his intelligence and resourcefulness were appreciated. Today, Agnes found out in class that the boy was very good at arithmetic, as if he had studied it before. She decided to ask him if he had done arithmetic exercises before, and Timati said that his father had taught him. It seems that his father was a great teacher, but Timati admitted that he simply talked a lot, was full of ardor and all sorts of nonsense. He was as fragile as Agnes, could faint after a short run, and his mother usually laughed very hard at him. Timati began to talk a little about his family. Greta was a knight in the Imperial Guard, and compared to her father, she was on a completely different level. But as soon as he started talking about his parents, the boy's expression immediately changed, and sadness was reflected in his eyes. Everything was good in his family. His mother loved him very much. His father always took care of him. Agnes responded to his words by saying that perhaps his father was not weak at all, but his mother was an incredibly strong person. Perhaps this was exactly how it was, because Greta was a truly worthy and incredibly strong girl. Suddenly the boy stood up from the table and asked if the lesson was over, and that he was bored to death doing the exercises today. Agnes was upset by these words, because every day she tirelessly prepared for lessons so that he would not be bored. But today, she heard these words. The teacher warned that she hadn't even given him homework, and the young gentleman was indignant. Did she really want him to study more after the lesson? Agnes laughed, but she was actually just teasing the young gentleman because he had just said it himself. He was bored. The young gentleman was perplexed for an adult. Agnes behaved too childishly. The teacher admitted that, in reality, adults are much more childish. The boy frowned. The teacher laughed. If he does this all the time, wrinkles will appear on his face. But for some reason today, the young gentleman was in no hurry to leave the lesson, and stated that he had much more important business. Agnes just said that adults also behave like children, and Tamati said that the teacher is also an adult. It was absolutely true. The young gentleman stood in complete bewilderment, while the lady tried with all her might not to laugh out loud. She called herself a generous teacher who doesn't get upset over such trifles, admitting that her patience is the size of an ocean. After these words, Tamati ran to the office door, while Agnes laughed at the behavior of the young gentleman. The teacher shouted after him that the student should say goodbye properly, and he should not run away silently after the lesson. Instead, the young gentleman opened the door, waved his hand, and shouted that he would definitely see the teacher tomorrow. It seemed that this was his limit for now, and the young master could not learn everything at once, and this was not at all something that could be corrected in a few days. The training was going just fine, and Agnes was sure that everything was fine with Tamati, and that he still had a chance to change. But after the lesson, she needed to focus again, and it was time for a lesson with a second adult student. The lady greeted Johann, who was not even surprised that Agnes had appeared at the door of the Duke's office again. He was informed that his lordship had given the teacher permission to enter, and it seemed that he had finally acknowledged her persistence. Johann wanted to open the door for the teacher with care, but she didn't need any help at all. She walked into the Duke's office, greeting Ethan loudly, but all she heard in the office was silence. It was quite strange because usually the teacher would hear his annoying voice as soon as she entered. The Duke's constant ignoring hurt more than she would like to admit, but not hearing his snide remarks from the doorway actually made her feel better. She seemed to be trying to brush it off, convincing herself that the Duke was only 25 years old. The heroine could not feel small, and sometimes his gaze drove her crazy, as if the Duke did not see a person in her and looked at her as a non-entity. All this time Agnes tried to act confidently, even though it was difficult to go through, but today the office was quiet and she decided to wait for him. She wanted to sit on the sofa and wait for a while, because today she was not going to postpone an important conversation. As soon as Agnes began to sit down on the sofa, she heard strange wheezing sounds, as if an old man was lying on it. But when she sat down on the sofa, she did not notice that on this sofa, under a white blanket, the Duke himself was lying and resting peacefully. Agnes fell to the floor in surprise as soon as she saw the sleepy young man she had just sat on crawl out from under the blanket. Ethan, seeing the teacher, even offered to call a doctor for her, because she was again sitting on the floor with a strange expression on her face. When she saw the Duke, her heart almost stopped. Agnes fearfully asked not to call anyone, and everything is fine with her. For some reason, the Duke slept here and not in his room, and the teacher even suggested that he was so busy that he had to take a nap on the sofa. Agnes asked excitedly if she had woken up the gentleman, who was simply taking a break from work at that time. The Duke admitted that there was someone causing too much noise in the estate today, and he had not rested since the beginning, and had not slept for a long time. Agnes noticed that the gentleman looked incredibly sleepy, and he simply needed rest more than ever now. The teacher said that good sleep was important for health, and the Duke asked to be spared from lectures because he was her student. But if Ethan were her student, she would never have allowed him to stay up all night and work constantly without rest. Being a student does not mean that the teacher will always be listened to, but Agnes continued to say that if you listen to the teacher, you can achieve good results. The Duke looked at the girl thoughtfully and admitted that she was as incredibly good at lying as she was at being persistent. But Agnes was not lying at all, and asked why a teacher would wish something bad on his student. After all, she just wanted everyone to eat well, sleep well, and live well. The young man chuckled, stating what he was sure was exactly what made a teacher a happy person. The lady was indignant. Did the gentleman really not believe her words? But he only sighed and realized that the girl was absolutely right. Agnes wanted the master to hear her and, grabbing him by the shoulders, asked him to take her words seriously. As soon as she touched his shoulders, Ethan immediately fell onto the sofa, and Agnes noticed that such a strong man fell like a rag doll. It turned out that he had last slept about 5 days ago, and Agnes angrily declared that at this rate the gentleman would soon die of exhaustion. The Duke did indeed look sleepy and relaxed, and when he rose from the sofa, he was unsteady, but still claimed to be full of energy. Even a healthy person would faint if he didn't sleep, and the sleepy Duke asked if the teacher was cursing him. Her words may have sounded bad, but she didn't mean it at all and wanted the gentleman to live a very long and happy life, so that he could get along with Timati and build a happy family relationship together, meet a good girl, so that he would no longer have to sleep alone. Agnes said that it was all because the Duke was not married, but the young man warned that if she came only because of this today, she could leave the office. Ethan said one thing: he doesn't plan on getting married, but even if he does, his partner won't be there to worry about his health. His words sounded reasonable. Agnes wanted to convey that for the Duke, a happy family life could be beneficial. The lady felt awkward, and she could not advise the Duke to marry, who understood that she simply had nothing to say. She herself was unmarried, and in fact, her parents constantly nagged her about marriage. So she couldn't pester a man who didn't have a second to sleep, and maybe it just took him longer. Agnes realized that it was necessary to change the subject urgently and ask the Duke to come to the sofa, because now even a short sleep would be useful for him. The young man could barely stand on his feet near the table from fatigue, so she grabbed his hand and dragged him straight to the sofa, despite his stubbornness. No one had ever behaved like that with the Duke, and the young man assumed that the teacher had really gone mad. But she smiled and said, They say a person can go crazy if he doesn't sleep for a long time. She sat him down on the couch and asked him to take a nap before he really went nuts with fatigue. Agnes even thoughtfully covered the Duke with a blanket so that he could finally get some sleep. She had to take care of her adult textbook, which she had just put to bed, and promised to guard the door so that no one would disturb him. The lady left the office, wishing the gentleman sweet dreams, confident that he would fall asleep immediately. But the Duke only looked in bewilderment at the teacher, who ran out of the office. This girl was too strange. The heroine was sure that the Duke would finally sleep peacefully, but as soon as she closed the office door, an unexpected meeting awaited her. Mr. Tristan stood near the door. He immediately recognized the teacher, whom he had never managed to meet. The lady understood that Her Highness the Crown Prince was in front of her, and she tried to greet him formally, but Tristan did not need it. It was etiquette, but Tristan smiled and admitted that the way she treated Ethan, she was capable of avoiding formality. The lady was embarrassed to admit it, and she had behaved terribly at the time, trying to prove something to the Duke, but the Crown Prince was having fun at the time. He suggested that we address each other informally, and would prefer a less formal address when he was outside the palace. She couldn't resist the words of the Crown Prince, and since the young man really said so, it meant that the lady could behave freely. Tristan admitted that he liked the teacher's straightforwardness and asked if she had just talked to Ethan. Tristan came to see the Duke, as he had some free time, and decided to take advantage of it. So the young man confessed that he simply ran away from the palace, inside which he felt as if he was suffocating. The only crown prince before his ascension was a bloodthirsty man and constantly started wars. Many said that once he became emperor, the entire empire would be mercilessly burned to the ground in fire. An aggressive character, a common example of a student avoiding classes, so Agnes admitted with a smile, Tristan was probably a difficult student. She hit the nail on the head. Every time Ethan and Greta had classes, the boy always slipped away. He found it much more fun to swing a sword in the street. In fact, the Crown Prince turned out to be a childhood friend of the Duke, and Agnes decided to ask the Crown Prince for a favor, even if it sounded rude. Tristan reminded her that he had asked to skip the formalities and asked what proposal the teacher wanted to ask for. This time, the heroine could not remain silent and admitted that his lordship had just fallen asleep and was in great need of rest. She said that he had barely managed to sleep for 2 hours in the past few days, so she asked the Crown Prince to let him rest a little longer. Agnes did not hide it. The Duke himself told about it and looked very tired, although he assured that he was completely fine. For some reason, the Crown Prince grinned as if he had been waiting for this moment. And that was the kind of face a man made when he was up to something, and Agnes wanted to know what he was up to. The Crown Prince was willing not to disturb his friend, but on one condition in return, he offered the teacher to spend time with him. Agnes didn't think it would be fun, but the boy insisted that the Duke was much more boring, so it was okay and they could just walk a little. It was not without reason that the Crown Prince invited the girl to walk with him through the wonderful, fragrant garden. He was interested to know about Greta's son, but Agnes could not talk freely about her students. The Crown Prince didn't intend to ask about anything serious and suddenly laughed, but the lady didn't understand his joke. Tristan understood that it seemed like the lady was still struggling with Master Ethan and trying to convince him, but she wouldn't call it a struggle. She said she was trying to mend the relationship between the student and the guardian, and while she was doing this, she was simultaneously saving her future. The Crown Prince heard that Greta's son was not an ordinary child, but Agnes admitted that Timati was a very kind boy. This little boy is very sensitive and kind, but the Crown Prince decided to tell him that he heard something. The teacher was worried that the Duke did not understand this part of Timati, and if nothing worked out, she would have nothing more to wish for. Tristan thought that Agnes and the Duke seemed to be at odds, but he was sure that this was not the boy's parent, but simply his uncle. Although he thought Agnes's efforts were very commendable, it was at this point that the teacher decided to ask if she was just wasting her time. Tristan had known the Duke for a long time. He knew him much better than the teacher and could give an honest answer. He sincerely admitted that all attempts could indeed be in vain, because the Duke would never be able to open his heart. With sadness in her eyes, the lady asked if Tristan really thought that all her efforts were in vain. And for some reason, the young man answered with complete confidence in his eyes, "To be honest, that's how it is." This answer made the teacher think, because with all her soul, she felt that she could change something. There was probably an honest conversation between them now, but she did not expect that the Duke would love Timati as his own child. She knew it was simply impossible, but that didn't mean their relationship had to remain so cold. Only a year has passed since Timothy lost his parents, and this year was filled with suffering and sadness for the boy. Tristan admitted that it had only been a year since the Duke had lost his sister, but he was sure he was incapable of showing affection. Perhaps Agnes wanted to see something more, and perhaps the Crown Prince was right, because she could try to change his thoughts, but not his essence. Sometimes it hurts people that others express their thoughts differently, but maybe the Duke will change his way of thinking, and the question remains how Timothy will perceive this. Tristan was sure it would be a good thing, and the best thing they could do now was to provide the child with a stable environment. That is why he recently proposed marriage to him, and the Duke himself said that he was not interested in family life. And even if he had married, who knows if this girl would have fallen in love with Timati, and Agnes did not understand how at that age one could only think about work. This conversation became more and more interesting for Tristan, and suddenly he asked what about Agnes herself. After all, she is the same age, but for some reason she is still not married and does not even think about marriage. Agnes stated that she was determined to remain alone. It was absolutely impossible, but in Tristan's opinion she had to admit Ethan was quite attractive. The heroine never even thought about family life. She didn't care about romance because she simply didn't want to die. Suddenly the young man asked if the girl could do him one small favor, and he asked that Agnes agree to be his partner at the upcoming social ball. Agnes did not understand why the Crown Prince asked her about this, but Tristan stated that inviting a partner to a ball did not require an explanation. And in any case, she would go with him because he was not going to accept a refusal as an answer to his application. In that case, Agnes wondered why the young man had asked about it at all, but Tristan was sure that as soon as the Duke found out about it, he would definitely show up. The Crown Prince played his game, trying to draw the teacher into it, who could not refuse because of his high title. The young man confessed that the teacher must understand that the Duke cannot give them the care that she so asks for, and in that case his wife must do it. He said that it just so happened that his cousin was interested in the Duke, and she was one of those ladies who would embrace his nephew with love. Tristan just wanted the Duke to finally pay attention to Dahlia, because then Timati would be surrounded by love and care. Hearing this, Agnes was incredibly happy and asked why the Crown Prince did not tell her about this from the very beginning. Soon the young gentleman found out that the teacher was going to the ball. He was outraged by who she was going to go there with. Agnes said that the Crown Prince had asked her to be his partner and that she was going to go with him. For the teacher, this was not such an important matter, since there was still a whole month left before the ball. For some reason, the young gentleman, upon hearing this, became incredibly upset and asked again if he was really planning to go here. The next second, a storm of anger engulfed him, and he simply began to shout, "Is it true that the teacher wants to go to the ball?" The heroine admitted that she could not refuse the Crown Prince himself because he offered to become his partner. He said he wouldn't take no for an answer, and the teacher promised to just be there for him, look around a bit, and come back right away. She couldn't tell the young gentleman that his uncle was going to look at the future bride. She had only heard that the imperial ball was an incredibly luxurious event, so she always dreamed of attending it at least once in her life. Agnes dreamed of visiting it with the groom her parents had once chosen for her. She wondered how the man was getting on now, and she had not seen him since the engagement annoyance. Perhaps after that incident he came to see her once or twice, but they never met in person. All these years they grew up together, so she liked the young man incredibly, but she could not even think about the high feeling of love. Considering that the heroine couldn't even remember his face, it was definitely not the kind of love they talk about in novels. She didn't want the young master to be so angry and nervous, and she carefully took his hands. Timati asked if the teacher was going only because she had no choice and could not refuse the Crown Prince. The boy sadly lowered his head and admitted that Agnes should not go to the ball with the prince. He shouted that he was ready to refuse him instead of her, just so that she would under no circumstances attend this event. The young gentleman began to point his finger at the teacher and assure her that she was not suitable for such a place, and he knew that she had never been to such an event before. Agnes asked Timati not to worry so much because it was just a social event and nothing more. But despite her persuasion, the young gentleman still continued to be nervous and angry, and was ready to do everything so that the teacher would not go. After all, she was only his teacher, and in his opinion she could not communicate with other people. On the one hand, there was something sweet about it because today Timati called Agnes his teacher for the first time. The lady covered her face with her hands, pretending to cry, but Timati knew perfectly well that this was not the case. Continuing to sob and covering his eyes with his hands, the young gentleman began to worry that the teacher was really crying. This technique probably worked, and Timati was even ready to call her a teacher, just so she wouldn't go to the ball. The young gentleman was incredibly cute now, and Agnes really wanted to look at his face now. She removed her hands and asked if she had really scared the boy, since his teacher had not cried at all and had not even been worried. Agnes thanked her, and for the first time the young gentleman became concerned, thinking that it would be difficult for her at such an event. Communication with other people was very important for the lady. She had not seen her friends for a long time, whom she wanted to at least greet. Timati was indignant. Are friends really those who get together and not alone? While the teacher assured him that friends are very important in a person's life. Now Timati wanted to know if the teacher really had a lot of friends, but it wasn't about quantity at all. Agnes told him that even the Duke had friends, but the young gentleman thought that the teacher was now making fun of his uncle. Even a person who considers himself the best in the world has best friends who will help him in difficult times. Timati didn't care about this at all now, and jealousy played within him because his teacher was supposed to be only next to him. He insisted that Agnes didn't need friends, and if she went to the ball, he still wouldn't allow it. The boy angrily shouted that he was ready to stop the teacher at any cost, and no one would dare to stop him. Agnes did not expect at all that the young master would perceive her departure in such a way, continuing to be aggressively jealous. It didn't seem like an empty threat, because if we were talking about Timati's tricks, he could even secretly rip her dress. To begin with, the lady asked Timati to calm down, laughing, "If the boy continues to frown like that, he will get wrinkles like an old man." It was time to put the plan into action. Things were about to get very busy, but Agnes had everything under control. They had very little time left to finish the lesson, and the teacher warned that the rest of the material would be left for home study. Every day, again and again, the Duke was busy with endless work, but today was not an ordinary day. When the clock hand stopped at 3, he put his pen aside, completely perplexed. After all, it was usually at this time that Agnes would burst into his office, telling him about his nephew's successes. It scared him how quickly habits were forming. Only a few days had passed, and he was constantly waiting for her at a certain time, and he could do nothing about it. Ethan remembered meeting this brave girl who was sitting in the manure and smelling bad. A private teacher named Agnes, and even Carlo and Johann admitted there was something unusual about her. Every day she tried desperately to fight for something meaningless, trying to guide the master to the true path. She was very noisy, but the Duke found it interesting to watch, and every time he was ready to listen to her a little longer. But now he couldn't understand why he actually tolerated her antics, because he never took her words seriously. Even Tristan noticed that the Duke liked her behavior, because in any other case he would have fired such a person long ago. The way this girl stood her ground without flinching was simply amazing, otherwise the Duke would not have allowed her to behave like that in the first place. Ethan completely agreed with Tristan's opinion, because for some reason he continued to tolerate her antics. When she was persistently trying to prove something to the Duke, and Tristan was watching it, it was incredibly funny. The Duke called it all just a little fun, but he admitted that the girl was doing her job well. Although she was loud, she never crossed the line, and the Crown Prince was even surprised. In the Duke's opinion, Agnes knew perfectly well when to leave, just at the moment when he began to get irritated. To him, she was just a funny private teacher, but Tristan found the girl quite nice. And it's incredibly cute when someone chases a wild animal without realizing how dangerous it is. Ethan was surprised, because he was the one in the role of the wild animal, and Tristan was glad that the young man was not at all interested in her. Because if there was one thing he hated, it was having to compete with his friend over a girl. The Duke had always known that Tristan had very strange tastes, but now he could not believe that they were so strange. At that moment, he remembered her outstretched hand, smelling of manure, and the Crown Prince warned him that he was going to invite this girl to the ball. He wanted to see her as his partner, but for some reason the Duke suddenly became silent and probably even got angry. Ethan asked why he should be angry since he had nothing to do with his nephew's teacher being like that. But for a second, Tristan even found the Duke terribly frightening, even more frightening than he had been before. Tristan said a little romance wouldn't hurt, and it didn't look like the teacher was planning on getting married anytime soon. When the Duke heard the words about romance, he realized that for the prince it was such a funny, sweet way of saying that he wanted to play with her. For some reason these words touched the gentleman, but he himself could not understand what had aroused such irritation in him. He knew perfectly well that Tristan would surely smile at Agnes when he invited her to the ball. The lady was always angry with the Duke, but she was overwhelmed with emotions and she would not even understand. Tristan does not plan to take responsibility. After this conversation, the young man could not stop thinking about it, and he understood whether it was possible that you had already agreed to become the Crown Prince's partner. But today, she still hadn't shown up in his office, and he decided to warn her not to fall in love with him so easily. Usually, Ethan's thoughts were occupied only with work, but now this fact was incredibly upsetting to him. During her vacation, Agnes wrote a letter to Westwick Manor, where she had previously worked. The countess of this estate was a very picky woman, and the heroine understood that she needed to be more careful in her communication. It just so happened that she invited her for tea at the perfect time, and everything worked out better than Agnes had even expected. The countess was indeed a very curious person, because Agnes had left so suddenly and had not even had time to contact her, but she had written her a letter anyway. She wasn't going to give up and simply realize that brute force wasn't the only way to influence the Duke. And he is probably celebrating his victory now, because the girl never showed up in his office. After being reborn, the heroine actually returned 14 years ago, and looking at the passers-by, she felt so strange to be here again. Outdated clothes of forgotten trends, ladies in starched dresses, and young men in strange clothes. The streets of the small town now seemed much cleaner than the heroine remembered, and as she rode in the carriage, she enjoyed every moment. But she was overcome by a sad feeling that she was the only one who did not belong to this world. She closed her eyes and tried to feel that she was really here, although her soul seemed to be very far away. Every time she closed her eyes and plunged into past memories, one moment seemed very terrible to her. It was as if she was about to open her eyes and return to the moment when the Duke mercilessly cut off her head. Agnes tried to calm down, and everything was fine. Little by little, everything was changing, and her future was about to change too. The carriage arrived at the Count's estate, and the coachman announced the arrival of the honored guest. They arrived much earlier than the heroine expected, but that was even better. She had hardly gotten out of the carriage when she heard loud children's voices, and she understood perfectly well who was meeting her. These were the same twins she had saved in her past life, and the children had been incredibly missing their teacher all this time. Little angels named Ben and Celine lived well after her departure, but they missed Agnes and could not forget about her. Ben immediately asked how Agnes had been doing all this time, and she happily admitted that she was doing well now. Celine couldn't contain her emotions and said in a sad voice, "Was the teacher really happy after she left them?" The little girl was outraged because the lady suddenly left without writing a single letter, and for her it was too mean. She once promised to write letters to Ben, but she had her own good reasons for that. Lady Westwick, the noble countess, greeted the teacher who had worked with her children for a long time. A lot of time had passed since the lady had left the Earl's estate, but the twins could not tear themselves away from the teacher, whom they had not seen for so long. They didn't even pay attention to their mother, although the teacher warned them that Celine should greet the countess. But Countess Westwick understood perfectly well that the children missed Agnes very much and was ready to wait as long as possible. Celine was still a playful little girl, and Agnes admitted that she was very sorry that she had broken off communication, and the children were probably really looking forward to it. She was so busy that she didn't even have time to write a couple of lines, but she never forgot about the children and thought about them constantly. As soon as I had some free time, she immediately came to them, and after telling the twins about it, they understood everything. Agnes was very sorry that she was late, but she missed the twins terribly. The kids started to quarrel among themselves because each of them demanded the teacher's attention, but at that moment the Countess decided to intervene. Agnes bowed before the lady, and it was even difficult for her to greet her, but the smiling lady asked to omit the formalities. The lady suggested having tea with the teacher, but warned that as soon as it was over, Agnes would return home. So she asked the kids to quickly change into clean clothes because there was another reason to hurry. The twins had already started fighting and arguing as usual, and they could never communicate calmly with each other. The Countess managed to send them to the palace, and Agnes finally exhaled enough to talk calmly with Lady Westwick. They went into a cozy gazebo in a blooming garden, and the lady told them about her new place of work. She told about Timati, the heir of that very Marquis Reynolds, who was now only 7 years old. The Countess heard that the young gentleman was not behaving like a typical 7-year-old child, or she admitted that he was a little disobedient. The lady asked if there was a special reason why the teacher suggested group lessons and Timati should study with her children. Agnes admitted that she loves the twins, Celine and Ben, very much and misses them incredibly. They had a very warm relationship with the Countess, and anyone who dared to lie to this lady with a snowy smile ended up regretting it. Naturally, Agnes was not in a position to lie when asking for help, and she was sure that Timati needed friends at his age. The Countess asked if the teacher really wanted to use her children for the sake of the young master. From the outside, it might have seemed that way, but the lady was shamelessly honest with her mistress, as always. The twins are kind and cheerful children, so the teacher wanted them to have a good influence on Timati, and he could learn a lot from them. And Timati is a good boy, but he is deeply wounded. Because of this, he is rude on the outside, so Agnes was sure that these two would definitely lead him to the best. The lady laughed, and it seemed that the teacher really liked the young gentleman, and she was worried about him. After all, she didn't hide the fact that Timati was a very sweet child, even though his behavior now was far from ideal. Lady Westwick said she still had doubts about the group lessons the teacher had proposed. But she trusted this girl, and happily informed that if Agnes so desired, then group lessons could certainly be tried. To be honest, the lady had not been able to find a new teacher after Agnes left, and would have been grateful if she had taught the twins again. And if Timati is so charming that he instills confidence, she can deal with 3 troublemakers at once. In return, the Countess asked her to join her for dinner that night, and at that moment, Agnes realized that she would now have to cope with 3 at once. She believed in her strength, and really wanted Timati to find friends and for the boy to grow up a happy man. That same evening, she reported everything to the butler, but Carlo was not sure that this could be a good idea. It was already difficult to cope with the young master, but he could not imagine how the teacher would cope with 3 small children. Carlo knew that the lady was the only one who considered the young gentleman a kind and gentle child. But he was still worried, because her standards were very different from the rest of the world, although Timati had recently begun to behave better. It was only thanks to the teacher's arrival that all the residents of the estate were finally able to sleep normally at night, and this was definitely progress. The butler was about to tell one little secret that he noticed after her appearance. When the lesson ends, Timati now continues to read books, although during lessons he always shouts that 4 hours is enough and he is bored. But now the young gentleman, instead of playing rough pranks after dinner and a bath, goes straight to bed and doesn't talk to the other workers at all. Timati shows no interest in anyone else, and the teacher heard this information for the first time. His overall progress was normal for a butler, and of course the teacher didn't know anything about it because she didn't monitor everything he did. To an outsider it might seem that he had become better, but he very much doubted that the boy was gradually changing. For some reason, this information incredibly upset the young lady, and she only silently looked at the butler, without understanding at all where she had made a mistake, and day after day she tried incredibly hard to help the young master. As he became softer, the people around him also became softer, but for some reason he began to isolate himself from the whole society. She was sure that if Timati treated others the same way he treated her, many would love him, and he would be glad to receive this love. Timati with difficulty opened his heart, but only to Agnes, and he still did not trust anyone else. Of course, it would be too easy if he had corrected himself in a month, then Timati's life would not have gone to waste in the teacher's opinion. That is why she suggested introducing group lessons, and Timati needs to learn how important other people are in his life. Carlo knew the teacher was absolutely sure of it, and they had no other choice, suggesting sending a man to Westwick to coordinate the schedule. Agnes hoped that the butler would understand her correctly, and bowing, she was incredibly grateful to him. But he asked if she had told the young gentleman about this, since they first needed to get his consent. Although young Mr. Timati is quite small, he still has the status of a Marquis. even if it is just a matter of making friends. The butler was sure that, given his status, even friends should be made with caution, and the master's communication was under the control of the Duke. Agnes had never heard of this before and just wanted the boy to finally have friends. Perhaps she acted too rashly. At that moment, she felt incredibly awkward. She intended to obtain his lordship's permission tomorrow and apologized for having acted too hastily. The butler said politely, "No need to apologize, and as soon as the teacher gets permission, they can continue this topic." His lordship would hardly mind. After talking with the girl's butler, it seemed like today would never end. She didn't understand why Timati stopped communicating with everyone except her, but most importantly, he stopped playing offensive pranks. The only desire today was to just go to bed early today and talk about group lessons tomorrow. But as soon as she decided to go to her room, she saw an uninvited guest on the threshold. It was Mr. Ethan, who asked if the teacher was returning home from work too late. For some reason, the Duke was waiting for Agnes outside the room, and for a moment she stopped, not understanding what was happening. It was almost 11 o'clock at night, and Agnes was just about to go to bed, and the Duke decided to find out what she had been doing all this time. Agnes was afraid that she would have to give an account of what she had done, and that was the only thought in her head. The Duke was indignant. Usually the lady has something to say and is more talkative, but everything she did was exclusively about the young gentleman. But as for what she had been doing all this time, she wasn't going to tell Ethan anything. The young man still stood persistently near her door as if demanding some explanation, but the lady was not going to report. She only asked if she could go to her room since the Duke blocked her way to the door. But the young man insistently asked her to answer where she had been and what the teacher had been doing all this time. The lady assumed that the gentleman was worried that she had done something inappropriate, but assured him that he should not think so and that she had certainly not disgraced his reputation during this time. Suddenly the Duke asked if the girl was with the Crown Prince at that time, but the window did not even expect to hear such a question. Ethan said he heard Tristan invite the teacher as a partner, and somehow he managed to find out about it. Out of nowhere, Ethan began to say that the teacher was not allowed to meet with the Crown Prince, and after his words, Agnes was completely perplexed. She did not understand why the Duke suddenly started talking about the Crown Prince and the invitation to the ball. And did she really want to say that a girl like her could not attract a titled gentleman? Agnes said she only accepted the invitation because he wouldn't take no for an answer, and she didn't intend to cause trouble for anyone. The heroine did not like it at all when someone gave her advice and angrily declared that the young man should leave if that was all he wanted to say. Agnes confessed that she had never forgotten her position, and it was strange that the Duke was standing at her door trying to find out something. In a fit of anger, the heroine declared that it would be wonderful if she went on a nice walk with His Highness, but today she returned from the Westwick family. And while we were on the subject, Agnes said that she suggested a group lesson to help Timati with his social development. The lady was confident she had said everything that needed to be said and was now asking the Duke to move away from the door while Ethan asked her to calm down for at least a second. Since he had come here personally, the lady understood that she would only calm down if he finally moved away from the door of her room. He carefully placed his hand on her neck, after which the girl immediately stopped screaming. Finally, there was peace and quiet for the Duke, and he timidly immediately removed his hand from her delicate skin. Something strange had just happened, and the Duke even smiled, but the heroine could not understand at all why he had touched her hair and neck. Suddenly, the young man said that his words about being delusional were a mistake and asked for forgiveness. He just wanted to tell the lady to be careful and not to suffer from someone's stupid pranks. In fact, he wanted to warn her and understood that she had to choose wisely who she associated with, and Agnes understood that he was simply worried. But such behavior was completely impossible for the Duke, and he carefully took the girl by the waist. The heroine closed her eyes from the unexpected touch, closing her eyes, completely not understanding what Ethan had in mind. But he simply took her by the waist to move her to another place and carefully opened the door to her room. The Duke also warned against walking so late at night and asked to return before about 9 in the evening. After he left, the lady was perplexed, and her face twisted in surprise and incomprehension. The Duke had just said strange words. Choose wisely, don't get hurt, don't come back late. She didn't understand what that had to do with her. Even her father never said anything about a curfew, but for some reason this man decided to act like this. Even though last night was a little awkward, the preparation for group lessons went smoothly. But for now, the teacher kept it a secret from Tamati. Now she needed to focus on changing the butler's mind, and when Tamati praised himself, she thought he was just bragging. But he reviewed and repeated the lessons to make sure, and it was no wonder that the boy had no time for homework. He probably wanted to impress the teacher, so today she decided to pretend she didn't understand anything. Haste could only do harm, and the lady decided to observe him during group classes to understand why he began to treat people like that. When he met Agnes, the butler was surprised, because the lady had not reported to his lordship recently, and had she finally given in. He simply noticed that the heroine had suddenly started avoiding him, and so he decided to find out if anything had happened. For some reason, the teacher behaved strangely and said that this was the butler's job and asked to report the results to the Duke himself. The butler was not at all against it, but today he only saw how the lady, at the mere mention of the Duke, ran as fast as she could into the dining room. She ran away on purpose to avoid questions, because even the thought of Ethan now caused strange emotions in her. She had no intention of avoiding the Duke, and she could not afford to do so under any circumstances, but for some reason, yesterday's situation had stirred up her feelings. After all, the young man had simply opened the door to her room, but for some reason now she was behaving very strangely. Yesterday the gentleman didn't even admit to anything, and it wasn't even an act of kindness. Agnes tried to convince herself that the Duke clearly didn't mean anything by it, and she had simply seen an unexpected side of him, and it had taken her by surprise. Agnes felt her cheeks begin to flush, but she knew she couldn't give in and make herself look like a fool. The great day of group lessons for Timati and the twins at the Duke of Battenberg's estate arrived. Lady Westwick had been telling the children from early morning to take care of the teacher and behave well. The butler, together with Agnes and the dissatisfied Timati, met the guests, and the teacher asked the lady not to worry under any circumstances. Mrs. Westwick left the children for a group lesson, and the butler politely invited her to follow him into the drawing room. The children waved their hands happily as soon as their mother left, promising to see her after the group lesson. Timati, looking at the little children who unexpectedly appeared in his palace, stopped dead in his tracks, not understanding what to do. To begin with, Agnes suggested that the children get to know each other and introduce the twins to young Mr. Timati. She understood that this was unexpected for the boy, but she warned him that from today they would start group lessons, but Timati didn't know anything about it. The teacher apologized for not telling the young gentleman in advance, but she did talk about the importance of group classes. The young gentleman immediately began to get nervous and shout, assuring that he absolutely did not need such lessons and why the teacher did not ask him. Timati did not understand why he needed friends, and after this question the teacher asked what the young gentleman wanted then. Looking at the lady, Timati admitted that she was the only friend he needed, and it was that same childish jealousy. The lady tried to convey that she was just a teacher, and not someone who could remain his friend for life. And everything is fine, and the boy just needs to get closer to new children to learn how to communicate with others. The young gentleman looked at the lady as if she had just betrayed his soul and broken his heart. But Agnes didn't even imagine that Timati would dislike this idea so much, but even in this state, he tried to talk about his feelings. The heroine could not allow Timati to grow up alone, because it seemed to her that the future Timati did not even know how to communicate with people. At that moment, the twins ran out in front of Agnes and shouted for the young master to stop scolding the teacher immediately. Celine called her teacher Agnes, and as soon as she said these words, the young master simply became furious. Timati did not understand what these children were talking about, who insisted that the boy had stolen their teacher, and Agnes said that before coming here she worked with these children. She asked the twins for a minute to talk to Timati, and she had not had the opportunity to talk to the young gentleman about the group lesson before. The twins always obeyed Agnes, and obediently went their separate ways to let her talk to the young master. The lady turned to the boy, who had stood like a stone mountain until now, and asked him to trust this time and join the children in learning. She promised that it would be much more fun this way, and she really hoped that the young master would now stop being angry. But instead, Timati, with tears in his eyes, asked Agnes to immediately disappear from his eyes so that he would never see her again. Celine walked up to the teacher and hugged her, saying that in that case they would take her away with them right now. After all, the young master himself just said that she should never show her face to him again. Celine squeezed the teacher's throat so tightly that she found it difficult to breathe, and the young master shouted for the girl to let her go immediately. At this point, a quarrel began between the children. When Celine tried to hug the teacher, the young gentleman assured her that Agnes would simply break down. Their conversation became increasingly tense. The young gentleman assured that she belonged to him. He would call her whatever he wanted. His anger crossed all boundaries, and Timati shouted for the little sly fox to immediately remove her pathetic little hands. Celine was indeed a very clever girl, and continued to tease the young gentleman, saying that his words embarrassed her. She held Agnes tightly and did not intend to remove her hands, and at that moment the young gentleman became so angry that he was simply exhausted with rage. Celine laughed that Timati called the teacher his, and that she is not at all someone's property or thing. The children continued to quarrel among themselves while Celine assured them that Agnes had recently been their teacher. And does the young master really think that she will always belong to him? Because if he doesn't like her, he shouldn't treat her so rudely. Celine asked the teacher to come back with them and asked why she allowed some kid to treat her like that. All this time, Agnes did not interfere in their argument, but Celine admitted that she was not going to be friends with the young master under any circumstances. But now, the moment had come when the teacher had to intervene, and she looked at the girl with a stern gaze. Celine stated that she hates it when someone talks to a teacher like she is a thing and treats her the same way. And the girl was indignant. Did the teacher really leave them to teach lessons to an impudent boor? The little girl was not going to accept this fact, but the young gentleman declared that he did not need her consent and did not want to hear her opinion. In that case, Celine asked her to fulfill her promise, because Timati had just said that he hated the teacher and wanted her to leave. They continued to argue, each trying to insist on their own, where Timati insisted that he had not said such a thing, and Celine proved the opposite. Now there was a struggle for the teacher's attention, and Celine tried to prove that the young master was too rude and said terrible words. But just now, Agnes noticed an incredibly sweet moment in their quarrel when Timati said out loud for the first time that he liked the teacher. She didn't even stop the two children from fighting and finally decided to intervene, suggesting that the children calm down and stop yelling. Timati insisted that in any case, Agnes was his teacher, and no matter how much Celine whined, she would never return to her. Celine said that the boy couldn't know this. If he continued to behave like a real rude person, the teacher would definitely leave him. It's just a matter of time until the moment comes when Agnes simply loses interest in him. The little girl seemed to know when to drive the young master crazy, and the boy was so tired of swearing that he simply asked her to shut up. Celine proved her truth by stating that they would treat the teacher much better than he did, and they loved her much more. Every word cut like a knife into the young master's heart, while Selina assured him that they even studied much better than he did. At some point, Agnes felt like she was completely out of place here, and the children continued to argue loudly among themselves. The lady couldn't even take sides, and during the argument she simply remained silent, realizing that teaching ethics did not allow this. Finally, when there was silence in the room, the young gentleman turned to Agnes with sad eyes. It was the first time he had called her teacher, and the lady had been trying for an incredibly long time to get him to treat her with respect. Timati tried incredibly hard and did not continue the scandal, admitting that if Agnes wanted to organize group lessons, he was ready to do it. The boy was filled with incredible emotions, and he only asked Agnes not to act as if these children were any different. The young master's mood was still too gloomy, but he asked to sort out the group lessons as soon as possible. But the young gentleman's plan turned out to be completely different, and he wanted to check who was better, the cunning fox or he. He called Celine a sly fox and called her little brother a sloth, because he never left the teacher's side and hugged her skirt. Now, the boy, pointing his finger at the children, said that he wanted to find out as soon as possible which of them was really well educated. And this group lesson, in his opinion, should show which of them is better suited to the role of a good student, and from that moment on, a real struggle for Agnes's attention began between the children.